There is a country sitting at the top of the world that has been doing strange things for a very long time, and the strangest thing about it is that nobody has ever been able to fully explain why. Scotland, a narrow, rain-soaked strip of land attached to the northern edge of Britain, smaller than the state of South Carolina, home to fewer people than the city of Los Angeles, and yet somehow responsible for a disproportionate share of the modern world's most foundational ideas, most haunting mysteries, and most unsettling archaeological discoveries. The deeper you look at this place, the weirder it gets, and people have been looking at it for a very long time. Here is what you learn when you start pulling at the threads of Scottish history. The surface story, the kilts, and the castles, and the whiskey, and the locks. That story is real, and it is beautiful. But underneath it is something older, something stranger, something that does not fit neatly into any of our standard frameworks for how civilizations develop, how human beings organize themselves, or how a small and geographically marginal piece of land ends up punching so far above its weight that historians still cannot agree on how it happened. We are going to spend several hours tonight going as deep as the subject allows. We are going to start before memory and before record, in the time when the land itself was still being assembled from the wreckage of ice. We are going to move forward through layers of mystery, through cultures that left extraordinary evidence of themselves and then vanished, through symbols no one on Earth has fully decoded, through structures that should not be standing, through a kingdom that disappeared from history in a single afternoon and has never been adequately explained, through an intellectual explosion that reshaped the entire Western world in about 50 years, and through a tragedy so total and so deliberate that its effects are still visible on the landscape today. And we are going to do all of it slowly, the way a place like this deserves. Because Scotland is not the kind of subject you rush through. Scotland is the kind of subject that rewards the person who is willing to sit still and let the strangeness accumulate. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The first thing you need to understand about Scotland is that it is geologically ancient in a way that is hard to wrap your mind around. The rocks in the northwest of Scotland, the Lewisian gneiss that makes up the bones of the Outer Hebrides and large portions of the northwestern mainland, are some of the oldest rocks exposed anywhere on the surface of the Earth. We are talking about 3 billion years old. 3 billion. For context, the dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago. Life first appeared on land about 500 million years ago. The rocks of the Outer Hebrides predate all of that by an almost incomprehensible margin. They were already ancient when the first fish grew legs and crawled onto a beach. Scotland is built from the wreckage of at least 2 separate continents that collided with each other and then drifted apart again. The Iapetus Ocean, a sea that no longer exists, once divided what is now Scotland from what is now England. They were different landmasses. They came from different directions. When they finally crashed together 400 million years ago, the collision created mountain ranges that were once as tall as the Himalayas. The Scottish Highlands are the heavily eroded stumps of those ancient peaks, worn down by hundreds of millions of years of weather and ice, until what was once a towering mountain chain is now a rolling, heathered landscape of extraordinary beauty. The Great Glen, the long diagonal valley that runs from Inverness in the northeast to Fort William in the southwest, the valley that contains Loch Ness, is not a river valley or a glacial valley. It is a fault line, a place where 2 sections of the Earth's crust ground past each other during those ancient continental collisions. The rocks on one side of the Great Glen Fault are completely different from the rocks on the other side. They came from hundreds of miles apart. When you stand at the edge of Loch Ness and look at the water, you are standing in a crack in the Earth that was created 400 million years ago and has never fully healed. Loch Ness is the famous one, the one that draws tourists from across the world, and we will say the obvious thing about it here, and then we will move on to more interesting ground. The loch is real, the monster almost certainly is not, but the loch itself is extraordinary in ways that rarely get discussed because the monster story fills up all the available attention. Loch Ness is 23 miles long, about a mile across, and nearly 800 feet deep. It contains more fresh water than all of the lakes in England and Wales combined. Because of the dark peat particles suspended in the water, visibility drops to near zero within a few feet of the surface. The water is cold enough, dark enough, and deep enough that large portions of it have never been properly explored. The bottom of Loch Ness is genuinely unknown territory. That is interesting entirely on its own terms, without needing a monster to make it strange. The ice came and went across this landscape multiple times. The last great glaciation ended about 12,000 years ago, and when the ice retreated, it revealed a country that was almost unrecognizable. Sea levels were different. The land itself was lower, depressed by the weight of ice that had been sitting on it for tens of thousands of years. A process called isostatic rebound, the slow upward bounce of land that has been relieved of enormous weight, has been lifting Scotland ever since. Scotland is still rising. The northern and central parts of the country are currently going up by a measurable amount every century, slowly tilting the land so that the south and southeast sink slightly while the northwest rises. This process has been going on for 12,000 years and will continue for several thousand more. The people arrived very quickly after the ice left. The oldest confirmed evidence of human presence in Scotland dates to about 12,000 years ago, which means that human beings were moving into the newly revealed landscape almost as soon as it was habitable. These were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, people who lived by hunting the animals that moved into the new landscape and gathering the plants that were beginning to colonize the freshly exposed rock and soil. They left traces of themselves in coastal shell middens, in the bones of animals they hunted, in the occasional stone tool deposited in places where they camped or worked. One of those traces is extraordinary. At a site called Cramond, near Edinburgh, and at several other locations along the Scottish coastline, archaeologists have found evidence of hunter-gatherer presence that extends back further than anyone initially expected. But the real revelation came from a site on the Isle of Islay, where tools dating to about 12,000 years ago were found in deposits that indicate a well-organized community, not simply isolated wanderers passing through. These people were already establishing patterns of seasonal movement and resource use that suggest a far more sophisticated relationship with the landscape than the standard hunter-gatherer stereotype implies. The Mesolithic period in Scotland lasted for thousands of years, from the first arrival of people after the ice until the introduction of farming around 6,000 years ago. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists assumed that this was a time of very sparse population, with small, scattered bands of people making minimal impact on the landscape. The assumption was based partly on the scarcity of the archaeological record and partly on a general tendency in archaeology to underestimate the sophistication of prehistoric people. Both of those assumptions have been systematically dismantled over the past few decades. What we now know is that the Mesolithic people of Scotland were sophisticated ecologists. They managed their landscapes through controlled burning. They exploited a wide range of coastal and inland resources in patterns that suggest detailed knowledge of seasonal availability. They maintained what appear to have been long-distance exchange networks, because raw materials that could only come from specific geological locations turn up at sites far from those sources. And in at least one extraordinary case, they were doing something that pushes at the boundary of what we normally mean by Mesolithic. At a site called Warren Field in Aberdeenshire, archaeologists discovered a series of pits dating to around 8,000 years ago. The pits are arranged in a specific pattern, and analysis of that pattern revealed something astonishing. The arrangement of the pits corresponds to the 12 lunar months of the year. More than that, the pits are oriented in a way that corrects for the drift between the lunar and solar calendars, compensating for the fact that 12 lunar months do not add up to exactly one solar year. This is sophisticated astronomical knowledge. This is calendar making. This is a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer population, 4,000 years before Stonehenge, 8,000 years before the birth of Christ, demonstrating an understanding of astronomical cycles that archaeologists did not believe was possible for people of this period. The Warren Field pits are the oldest known calendar structure in the world. Not the oldest in Britain, the oldest anywhere, and they are in Scotland, in a field in Aberdeenshire. built by people who are often described as primitive hunter-gatherers, people who, according to the old textbook version of history, should have been entirely focused on day-to-day survival, with no time or cognitive capacity for astronomical observation and systematic record-keeping. The fact that these pits exist forces a reassessment of everything we think we know about the cognitive and cultural sophistication of Mesolithic people. If hunter-gatherers 8,000 years ago in Scotland were tracking the lunar calendar with enough precision to correct for its drift against the solar year, what else were they doing that we have not yet discovered? What knowledge systems did they possess? What observations did they make? What structures did they build out of organic materials that have long since decayed, that we will never find at all? These are questions without answers, and they are the right kind of questions. They tell you that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. They tell you that the standard story of human development in these islands, the story that goes from primitive wanderers to sophisticated civilization in a neat progression, is almost certainly wrong in ways we are only beginning to understand. Farming arrived in Scotland around 6,000 years ago, brought by people who were migrating north and west from continental Europe, crossing the land bridges and narrow sea channels that connected Britain to the continent and to Ireland. The adoption of farming changed everything. It changed where people lived, how they organized their communities, what they ate, how they thought about land and ownership and the future. It also changed, completely and permanently, what they built. The Neolithic people of Scotland built things that are still standing today. They built them out of stone because stone is what Scotland has in abundance, and they built them with a degree of sophistication that continues to astonish archaeologists and engineers. But the most extraordinary thing about what they built is not the technical achievement. It is the question of why. Scotland's most extraordinary Neolithic complex sits in the far north, on the Orkney Islands. Orkney is a group of islands off the northern tip of the Scottish mainland, separated from it by a turbulent stretch of water called the Pentland Firth. The islands are flat and treeless and exposed to North Atlantic weather that can be genuinely violent. They do not look, at first glance, like the kind of place that was once one of the most culturally and intellectually significant locations in all of prehistoric northwestern Europe. But that is exactly what Orkney was, for a period of about 1,500 years between roughly 5,000 and 3,500 years ago. The heart of Neolithic Orkney is the collective name given to the group of monuments in the western part of the mainland island that together constitute one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. The site includes the Ring of Brodgar, the Stones of Stenness, the Ness of Brodgar, and the Tomb of Maeshowe. All four are extraordinary in their own right. Together they represent a concentration of Neolithic building effort that has no parallel anywhere in northwestern Europe. Maeshowe is a chambered tomb built about 5,000 years ago. From the outside, it looks like a large, grass-covered mound sitting in a flat field. You would not necessarily stop to look at it if you did not know what it was. You walk through a low stone entrance passage that requires you to bend almost double, and then you stand up into a corbelled stone chamber that is so precisely built and so well preserved after 5,000 years that it genuinely takes your breath away. The walls are constructed from carefully selected and fitted sandstone slabs. The corbelling, the technique of progressively overlapping stone courses to close off a ceiling, is done with a precision that modern stonemasons still admire. The chamber has been dry for 5,000 years. The construction is so tight that it does not leak. But the technical sophistication of Maeshowe is not the most interesting thing about it. The most interesting thing is that on the midwinter solstice, the setting sun shines directly down the entrance passage and illuminates the back wall of the chamber. For a few weeks around the shortest day of the year, the sun at sunset lines up exactly with the passage and floods the interior with light. This is not an accident. This required the builders to understand the movements of the sun, to choose the site accordingly, to orient the structure precisely, and to engineer the passage to the correct angle. They were doing astronomy and architecture simultaneously, in stone, 5,000 years ago. Inside Maeshowe, the chamber walls are carved with runes. This might seem like an obvious thing to mention, runes in an ancient tomb, until you understand that the runes in Meisho were carved approximately 4,500 years after the tomb was built. They were carved by Vikings. In the 12th century CE, a group of Norse warriors took shelter in Meisho during a winter storm and spent their time carving messages into the walls of a tomb that was already ancient when Rome was founded. The runes are, depending on how you look at them, either the world's oldest graffiti or a striking piece of historical continuity. Some of them are mundane. Some record that the men were certain a treasure had been buried in the mound, which it had not. One of them says that the men who broke into the mound were the greatest warriors in Orkney. Another says that this is true and that the person who carved the first inscription carved it badly. The Vikings who sheltered in Meisho were themselves living in the ruins of a civilization that had collapsed over 1,000 years before they were born. The Neolithic Orcadians who built Meisho were separated from the Vikings by a gap of time roughly equal to the gap between the Vikings and us. Sitting in that chamber, reading those runes carved into 5,000-year-old walls, you are in contact with at least 3 completely distinct periods of human history, all converged on the same stone room. The stones of Stenness, a short distance from Meisho, are a ring of standing stones dating to roughly 5,100 years ago, which makes them among the oldest standing stone circles in the world. They predate Stonehenge by about 500 years. The original circle probably had 12 stones. Only 4 are still standing, but they are massive. The tallest is almost 20 feet high. They are made from local Orcadian sandstone, which splits naturally into large flat sheets, giving the standing stones at Stenness and elsewhere in Orkney a distinctive, tall, thin profile that looks almost architectural. They look less like boulders that have been stood on end and more like enormous slate tablets driven into the ground. Within the stones of Stenness, archaeologists found evidence of fire, of feasting, of the deposition of animal bones. This was a place where things happened, where people gathered, where ceremonies of some kind were performed. The specific nature of those ceremonies is unknown and probably unknowable, but the scale of the gathering that must have taken place is evident from the effort that went into creating the monument. Moving stones this size, standing them upright, selecting the site and orienting the circle, this required organized labor on a scale that implies a population far larger and more socially complex than the Orkney Islands could have sustained on their own. This is one of the central puzzles of Neolithic Orkney. The islands were never large enough to feed the workforce that must have built these monuments. The scale of the construction implies regional coordination, the gathering of people from across the islands and possibly from the Scottish mainland for collective building projects of enormous ambition. What drew them together? What was this place that it merited such a gathering? What was happening at Stenness and Brodgar and Meisho that made thousands of people willing to travel long distances and perform extraordinary feats of engineering? The Ring of Brodgar is about 2 miles from the stones of Stenness, across a narrow neck of land between 2 lochs. It is a henge monument, a bank and ditch enclosure, containing a stone circle. The outer bank measures about 340 feet in diameter. There were originally 60 stones in the ring. 27 are still standing. The quarrying and moving and erecting of 60 stones of this size, the digging of the encircling ditch through solid bedrock, the construction of the bank, this represents an investment of human effort that archaeologists have estimated at over 80,000 man-hours. That is not 80,000 hours of one person's time. That is 800 people working for 100 hours, or 400 people working for 200 hours, all coordinated, all fed, all housed, all directed by someone who knew what the finished product was supposed to look like. We do not know why the Ring of Brodgar was built. We do not know what ceremonies took place there. We do not know who the people were who built it, in the sense of what language they spoke, what they believed, what gods they worshipped, what stories they told. The physical evidence tells us where they stood and what they moved, but not what they meant by any of it. This is archaeology's fundamental limitation and its fundamental invitation. The evidence is real. The interpretation is perpetually open. And then there is the Ness of Brodgar, the site that has changed everything we thought we knew about Neolithic Orkney. and, by extension, about the Neolithic period across the British Isles. The Ness of Brodgar is the strip of land between the Stones of Stenness and the Ring of Brodgar, the narrow neck connecting the two lochs. For a long time, archaeologists drove past it on their way to the famous monuments. It was farmland. It looked unremarkable. And then, in 2004, someone noticed some features in a field that suggested there might be more to this particular strip of land than it appeared. What the excavations at the Ness of Brodgar revealed over the following 2 decades was staggering. Beneath the farmland was a massive Neolithic temple complex, a site of buildings enclosed within massive walls, some of the largest Neolithic structures found anywhere in Europe, decorated with carved stone artwork, filled with evidence of feasting and ceremony on a scale that suggests this was more than a local gathering place, but a destination, a pilgrimage site, a centre of religious and cultural activity for the whole of northwestern Scotland and perhaps beyond. The buildings at the Ness of Brodgar were substantial. They had stone furniture, built-in cupboards, hearths. The walls of some buildings bore painted designs in red, yellow and orange, ochre pigments applied to the stone surfaces. This is the oldest polychrome painted architecture found in Scotland, and it is 10 times older than the pyramids of Giza. The site was in use for over 1,500 years, longer than the entire period from the birth of Christ to the present day. Generations of builders modified and rebuilt and expanded the complex. This was not a monument built in a single great effort and then abandoned. This was a living religious centre that functioned continuously for a millennium and a half. And then, at the end of that period, something happened that is both dramatic and deeply mysterious. The Ness of Brodgar was deliberately decommissioned. The buildings were systematically demolished, the roofs were pulled down, the contents of the buildings were removed or destroyed, and to mark the end, the people of the Neolithic Orkney performed what archaeologists estimate was the largest single animal sacrifice event ever documented in prehistoric Britain. They slaughtered at least 400 cattle and feasted on them. The bones of those animals, deposited in a single great midden at the site's closure, represent evidence of an event of extraordinary communal significance. Something was ending. Something was being deliberately ended, and whoever ended it wanted to be sure it was ended properly. What was ending? The Neolithic period itself, as it turned out. Shortly after the Ness of Brodgar was decommissioned, the culture that had built it effectively ceased to exist. New people arrived in Britain and Ireland, carrying a different culture, different genes, different pottery, different beliefs. Genetic analysis of ancient human remains from this period has revealed something that was, when the results first came in, genuinely shocking. The people who built Stonehenge and Maeshowe and the Ness of Brodgar and the Ring of Brodgar, the Neolithic farmers who had occupied Britain for nearly 2,000 years, were replaced with almost shocking totality. The incoming culture, people we call the Beaker people because of their distinctive pottery, interbred with the existing population so thoroughly that within a few centuries almost no genetic trace of the original Neolithic population survived. This was not a gentle cultural transition. This was a wholesale population replacement, one of the most dramatic genetic events in the human history of the British Isles. And it happened in a very short period of time. The cause is debated. The scale is not. The people who built the great monuments of Orkney and Wiltshire and Ireland, the people who feasted at the Ness of Brodgar and calibrated the midwinter sun at Maeshowe, had essentially no surviving descendants in the direct genetic line within a few centuries of the Beaker people's arrival. This creates a peculiar situation. The monuments they built are still there, Maeshowe, the Ring of Brodgar, the Stones of Stenness. These have survived 5,000 years, but the people who built them, and whatever meaning they attach to them, are almost entirely gone. What they believed, why they built what they built, what the midwinter sun flooding into Maeshowe meant to them, we will never know. We can measure the alignments and estimate the labour and excavate the feasting deposits, but the interior life of the people who created all of this is permanently beyond our reach. Scotland got stranger, not simpler, as history progressed. The Bronze Age brought metalworking and new monument types, and continued the elaborate tradition of burial with grave goods that suggests a belief in the afterlife, or at least in the importance of equipping the dead for whatever comes next. The Iron Age brought a technology of warfare and fortification that transformed the Scottish landscape in ways that are still visible today. But it also brought something that has no real parallel anywhere else in the world. The brochs. A broch is a type of dry stone tower that was built in Scotland, primarily in the north and west and the islands. During the Iron Age, roughly between 400 BCE and 200 CE, there are approximately 500 brochs still traceable in Scotland. They are found nowhere else on Earth. This is not an exaggeration or a simplification. Brochs are uniquely Scottish. Nothing like them has been found in Ireland, or England, or France, or anywhere else in the world. They are a Scottish invention, a Scottish architectural tradition, and their existence raises questions that archaeologists are still arguing about. A broch is essentially a round, hollow tower built from dry-laid stone, meaning mortar-free, with walls that in some cases reach 40 to 50 feet high. The walls are thick, typically between 12 and 20 feet, and they are hollow, with galleries and stairs running through the wall space. The internal diameter is usually about 30 feet. There was no floor above ground level in the original design. The tower was essentially a large drum of stone, with an interior space and a complex wall structure that provided both living space within the galleries and a defensive circuit around the interior ground floor. The engineering of a broch is genuinely impressive. The walls taper slightly as they rise, giving the structure a slight inward lean that contributes to its stability. The hollow wall galleries distribute weight and allow the structure to flex slightly without cracking. The dry-laid construction, using no mortar, actually makes the walls more resilient to certain kinds of stress than mortared walls would be, because the individual stones can shift slightly without the whole structure failing. Someone, at some point in Scottish prehistory, worked all of this out and then taught it to other people. And those people built 500 of these towers across the northern half of Scotland. The broch at Moosa, on the island of Shetland, is the best preserved. It stands about 43 feet high, which makes it the tallest surviving prehistoric building in Scotland and possibly in the British Isles. It was built roughly 2,000 years ago. It is made from local Shetland stone, carefully selected and dressed and laid. The walls are still vertical. The structure is still sound. You can walk into it through the original ground-level entrance and climb the internal staircase within the wall galleries and stand at the top and look out over the North Atlantic. The Moosa broch has been continuously significant throughout recorded Scottish history. It appears in the Norse sagas more than once. In one saga, it is used as a refuge by a couple who have eloped without family permission. In another, it is besieged by a Norse earl who cannot capture it. The fact that a Viking army could not take a building that is 30 feet in diameter and 40 feet tall with a single narrow entrance tells you something about the defensive effectiveness of broch design. But here is the question that the brochs keep raising, and that no one has fully answered. Why brochs? Why this specific design, in this specific region, at this specific time? There are other round towers in the world, in other cultures, but none that share the specific hollow-wall double-skin construction of the Scottish broch. There are defensive structures throughout prehistoric Europe, but none that look quite like this. The broch is a unique solution to what appear to be uniquely Scottish problems of the Iron Age period, and the sophistication of that solution implies either a single brilliant inventor whose design spread across a wide region, or a tradition of architectural knowledge that was developed and refined over time within a specific cultural tradition. Neither explanation is entirely satisfying. The distribution of brochs across Scotland, concentrated in the north and west, in the Hebrides and Orkney and Shetland, suggests that they were built by a specific cultural group or groups, but the genetic and archaeological evidence for who those people were is patchy. What we do know is that the brochs were built during a period of significant social instability, a period when raiding and violence appear to have been common enough that the investment in a 40-foot stone defensive tower was considered worthwhile. Whatever was happening in Iron Age Scotland, It was serious enough to justify building 500 individual fortresses scattered across the landscape. The Iron Age also brought to Scotland the people we now call the Picts. Or rather, it brought the ancestors of the people who would eventually be called the Picts, because the name itself only appears in Roman sources from around 300 CE, and by that point, the people in question had been living in northern Scotland for a very long time, without anyone calling them anything other than whatever they called themselves, which we do not know. The Picts are one of Scotland's deepest mysteries. They were the dominant culture of eastern and northern Scotland for most of the first millennium CE. They built kingdoms, they made art of extraordinary sophistication, they converted to Christianity, they fought off Viking raids, they built churches and monasteries, and then, in the 9th century, they disappeared from history, not gradually, not through conquest or absorption over many generations, but with a speed and totality that historians still cannot fully explain. What the Picts left behind is abundant and extraordinary and deeply confusing. Carved stones, hundreds of them, scattered across the landscape of eastern Scotland. These stones are carved with symbols, and those symbols are like nothing else in the artistic tradition of Dark Age Europe. They include highly abstract geometric forms. The Pictish beast, a creature whose anatomy does not correspond to any animal that has ever lived. The double disc and Z-rod, the crescent and vedrod, the mirror and comb, the triple oval, the Pictish flower. These symbols appear on carved stones across a territory roughly equal to modern Scotland, north of the Firth of Forth. They appear on jewellery and silverwork. They are carved into cave walls and rock faces. They are clearly a system of communication, but no one has cracked them. Scholars have been studying Pictish symbols for well over a century. The stones bearing them were being noticed and recorded by antiquarians in the 18th and 19th centuries. The symbols have been catalogued and mapped and analysed. Statistical analysis has been applied to them to determine whether they follow grammatical patterns consistent with written language. The results of that analysis are ambiguous, and the ambiguity is itself informative. The symbols do appear to follow rules of combination and placement that suggest they are communicating something specific, but what that something is remains unknown. The fundamental problem is that the Picts left no bilingual inscription, no Rosetta Stone, no text that appears in both the Pictish symbol system and in a language we can read. There are inscriptions in the Ogham alphabet on some Pictish stones, using a letter system borrowed from Irish tradition, but the language of those Ogham inscriptions appears to be a form of Old Irish, and the symbols appear separately, as if the two systems were coexisting on the same stone without translating each other. Or the Ogham inscriptions are in a form of the Pictish language itself, which was possibly related to the Brittonic Celtic languages spoken in Wales and southern Scotland, but which has survived in only the most fragmentary form. Some researchers argue that the Pictish symbols are not a form of writing at all, but a system of heraldic or clan identification, markers of personal or family identity rather than encoded language. This would explain why the same symbols appear in the same combinations repeatedly across a wide territory without ever appearing to tell a story or convey a narrative. It would make them more like logos than letters. But even if that interpretation is correct, the question of what specific identities or affiliations the symbols represent remains entirely open. The Picts also produced some of the finest metalwork of Dark Age Europe. The Traprain Law treasure, found in East Lothian in 1912, is a hoard of Roman silver dating to the early 5th century CE. It includes hundreds of pieces of Roman silverware, much of it deliberately cut up, broken into fragments of a relatively consistent size. This cutting up of silver, called hack silver, was a common practice in the early medieval period as a way of using precious metal as a portable medium of exchange. The silver in the Traprain Law hoard has been hacked into pieces small enough to weigh out and trade. What makes the Traprain Law hoard extraordinary is not its size or its beauty alone, though both are considerable. It is the question of how and why a very large amount of Roman silver ended up buried on a hilltop in southern Scotland. The Romans never conquered Scotland north of the Antonine Wall. They visited, they traded, they raided, they negotiated, but they did not occupy. And yet here is their silver, buried in quantity in a region that was never Roman territory, cut up for use as currency by people who did not use Roman money in the standard way. The interpretations range from legitimate trade to tribute payment to outright theft. All three may be partially correct. The relationship between Scotland and Rome is one of the most interesting aspects of Scottish history, and it almost entirely took the form of Rome failing to conquer Scotland. The Romans took one look at the northern part of Britain and decided, at least twice, that it was not worth the effort. Hadrian's Wall, which runs across northern England, from the Solway Firth in the west to the River Tyne in the east, is often described as the northern boundary of the Roman Empire. This is accurate in the sense that it marks the limit of permanent Roman occupation. It was built on the orders of the Emperor Hadrian, beginning around 122 CE, and it is an extraordinary feat of engineering. 73 miles long, up to 15 feet high, manned by a series of forts and mile castles and signal towers. It represents the Roman Empire's formal declaration of where it ended and where the unconquered north began. But Hadrian's Wall was not the first line. 20 years after its construction began, under Emperor Antoninus Pius, the Romans pushed north again and built a second wall, the Antonine Wall, across the waste of Scotland between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde. This wall was shorter, about 37 miles, and built primarily from turf rather than stone. It was held for about 20 years and then abandoned. The Romans pulled back to Hadrian's Wall and never made another serious attempt to push the border northward. This is interesting not primarily because of what it says about Roman military capability, which was obviously formidable. It is interesting because of what it says about Scotland north of the Forth Clyde line. Something about the people living there, the people the Romans called Caledonians and later Picti, made the empire decide that the cost of controlling them was not worth paying. The Romans who wrote about the Caledonians described them with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. They were formidable warriors. They used terrain and weather as weapons. They did not fight in the open field where Roman tactical discipline could be applied effectively. They raided, they retreated, they returned. The account in Tacitus of the Battle of Mons Graupius, where a Roman general called Agricola defeated a large Caledonian force, ends with the observation that the Caledonians dispersed and the Romans celebrated a victory that changed nothing because the Caledonians simply melted back into the hills and continued to be exactly who they were. The Caledonian leader at Mons Graupius, or at least the person Tacitus called the Caledonian leader, was a man whose name Tacitus records as Calgacus. This name may be Latinized from a Brittonic original meaning something like the swordsman. Tacitus gives him a speech before the battle that is one of the more striking pieces of rhetoric in Latin literature, not because it was necessarily anything like what Calgacus actually said, since Tacitus was composing it, but because of what Tacitus chose to put in his mouth. The speech includes the phrase that is possibly the most famous thing any Scotsman, real or imagined, has ever said. They make a desert and call it peace. The sentiment is that the Romans claimed to bring civilization while actually bringing destruction. It is attributed to a man who almost certainly did not say it, in a language he almost certainly did not speak, by a Roman writer who was at minimum in the camp of the people being criticized. And yet it has been quoted as a critique of imperialism for 2,000 years. The Picts eventually disappeared from the historical record in the 9th century, in circumstances that remain contested. The traditional account, the account you will find in most history books, says that the Pictish kingdom was merged with the Gaelic kingdom of Dal Riata by a king called Sinead mac Ailpin, better known in English as Kenneth MacAlpin, creating the combined kingdom of Alba that is generally considered the predecessor of the modern Scottish state. In this account, Kenneth MacAlpin was a Gaelic king of Dal Riata who inherited or conquered the Pictish throne and ruled both peoples, and over the following generations the Pictish culture was absorbed into the dominant Gaelic culture. But there are problems with this account. The main problem is that it is not entirely clear that this is what happened. The sources for 9th century Scottish history are sparse and sometimes contradictory, The claim that Kenneth MacAlpin was half Pictish through his mother, which would have given him a claim to the Pictish throne through Pictish succession rules that apparently favoured the maternal line, appears only in later sources that may be unreliable. The mechanism by which the Picts became Scots, by which a people with a distinct language and a rich artistic tradition and a developed kingdom became simply part of a broader Gaelic culture within a few generations, is not fully understood. Some scholars have argued that the disappearance of the Picts was not gradual absorption but something more dramatic, that it involved violence or a catastrophic plague or some other shock that destroyed the Pictish aristocracy and its capacity to maintain and transmit the culture. The Viking raids of the 9th century were devastating to the Pictish heartland in the east of Scotland. There is evidence of significant population disruption in this period. It is possible that the Pictish language, which was already a minority tongue in a world where Gaelic was increasingly dominant in church and court, simply could not survive the loss of the aristocratic elite that would have been its primary speakers and transmitters. What this means is that the people who carved those extraordinary standing stones, the people who wore that exquisite silver, the people who held off the Roman Empire and then held off the Vikings for long enough to convert to Christianity and build a sophisticated medieval kingdom, simply ceased to be a distinct people within a few generations. The symbols they carved remain, scattered across eastern Scotland, and no living person knows what they mean. Dalriata is itself an extraordinary story. It was a kingdom that straddled the North Channel, the narrow body of water between the southwestern tip of Scotland and the northeastern coast of Ireland. At its height, in the 6th and 7th centuries CE, the kingdom of Dalriata included what is now Argyll in Scotland and the northern part of County Antrim in Ireland. People, armies, priests, poets, and ideas moved back and forth across the North Channel as freely as they moved within any of the kingdom's territories. The sea was not a barrier. The sea was a highway. This maritime dimension of early Scottish history is frequently underestimated. The people of the western seaboard of Scotland and Ireland shared a common culture, a common language, common artistic traditions, and common political structures that made the water between them largely irrelevant to their daily lives. The Gaelic language, which today survives in Ireland and Scotland in the forms of Irish and Scottish Gaelic, was once a single tongue spoken across both sides of the Channel and on the islands between them. The divergence into distinct dialects and eventually distinct languages happened gradually over the centuries as the political connections loosened and the populations followed somewhat different historical paths. From Dalriata came one of the most significant figures in the religious history of these islands, and possibly of Europe. Columba, also called Colmcille in Irish, a prince of the powerful northern Uí Néill dynasty, left Ireland in 563 CE and sailed to the small island of Iona off the southwestern coast of Scotland. He established a monastery there that would become one of the most influential religious centres in the medieval world. Iona is tiny. It is 3 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. It sits at the southwestern end of the island of Mull, separated from it by a sound about a mile across. In terms of its physical scale, it is entirely unremarkable. In terms of its historical influence, it is almost impossibly significant. The monastery Columba founded at Iona became the base for the Christianization of Scotland and much of northern England. Missionaries from Iona travelled throughout the British Isles and into continental Europe, carrying with them a form of Christianity that had developed in the distinctive cultural and geographical context of the Western British Isles, what historians call the Celtic Church or the Insular Church. This was not a heretical or schismatic Christianity, but it had developed certain practices and traditions that differed from the practices of Rome, and those differences would eventually produce significant conflict. The most famous product of the Iona scriptorium is the Book of Kells. Although whether this extraordinary illuminated manuscript was produced entirely at Iona or partly at another monastery in Ireland is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. The Book of Kells is now housed in Trinity College, Dublin, and it is one of the most visited objects in the world. People queue to see it. It is displayed in a custom-built reading room and illuminated to preserve the pigments while allowing viewing, and it repays the looking. The artwork in the Book of Kells is of a complexity and precision that is almost incomprehensible when you consider that it was produced by human hands using quill pens and paints made from ground minerals and plant extracts without magnification in the 7th or 8th century CE. The intricacy of the Book of Kells is aesthetically astonishing. It is evidence of a culture of scholarly and artistic production that was, in the early medieval period, genuinely among the most sophisticated in the world. The monasteries of the Scottish and Irish tradition, Iona and Lindisfarne, and Clonmacnoise, and dozens of others, were places where Greek and Latin texts were copied and preserved, where theological and philosophical questions were debated, where new forms of religious life were being invented. In the period sometimes called the Dark Ages in Europe, these islands were places of significant intellectual activity. Iona itself became a royal burial ground. According to tradition, 60 kings were buried there, including kings of Scotland, Ireland, and Norway. Whether the exact count is accurate is less important than the fact that Iona was considered a site of such sanctity that the powerful of the early medieval world wanted to be buried there. The royal burial ground, called Reilig Odrain, still exists. The small chapel of St. Oran that stands within it is possibly the oldest surviving building in Scotland, dating to the early 12th century. It is surrounded by grave markers that span more than 1,000 years. The Crannogs are another piece of the Scottish story that most people outside the country have never heard of, and that most people inside the country take entirely for granted without pausing to consider how strange they actually are. A Crannog is an artificial island, a human-made platform built in a loch or a river, used as a dwelling site. Scotland has over 500 identified Crannogs. They range in date from the Neolithic period, about 5,000 years ago, all the way through to the 17th century CE, making them one of the longest-lasting building traditions in Scottish history. The basic concept of a crannog is simple enough. You pile materials, stones, timber, brushwood, clay, in a shallow part of a loch until you have created an island large enough to build a house on. You build your house. You connect your artificial island to the shore with a wooden causeway or a footbridge. You live there. What is less simple is the reason for doing this. Building in a loch is significantly harder than building on land. The materials have to be transported by boat or raft. The water is cold. The site is inherently less stable than solid ground. The effort involved in creating and maintaining a crannog is considerably greater than the effort involved in building an equivalent structure on land. So why did people across 5,000 years of Scottish history keep choosing to live on artificial islands in lochs? The most common explanation offered by archaeologists is defense. A crannog on an island in a loch is easily defended. You can pull up the causeway. Anyone who wants to attack you has to cross open water in boats, giving the defenders a significant advantage. In periods of instability and raiding, the security offered by a crannog site may well have outweighed the inconvenience of living on an artificial island. But this explanation does not fully account for the persistence of crannogs across such a long span of time and such varied historical circumstances. In the Neolithic period, when the first crannogs were being built, the nature of the threats people faced was very different from the threats of the Iron Age or the medieval period. The choice to build in water has something to do with defense in some periods. It may have had other meanings in others. The loch itself, in the cosmology of many of the cultures that built crannogs, was more than water. It was a boundary, a liminal space, a place between worlds. Building in a loch may have been as much about ritual and symbolic significance as about military practicality. The Scottish Crannog Centre on Loch Tay in Perthshire was built as an experimental archaeology project to reconstruct what a Bronze Age crannog would have looked like. It used traditional techniques and traditional materials, and the process of building it taught the archaeologists and craftspeople involved a great deal about the skill and effort that went into crannog construction. The finished building, a round, thatched house sitting on its timber platform above the water of Loch Tay, is a beautiful thing. Standing inside it, surrounded by the sounds of the loch and the smell of the thatch, gives you a strong sense of a way of life that was normal for thousands of years in this landscape and is now completely gone. The clachans, the small clusters of related families who shared land and labour and kinship in the traditional Highland economy, persisted in Scotland until the 18th and 19th centuries. They were the social unit through which the traditional Scottish landscape was organised and worked, and then they were destroyed. Not gradually, not through the slow attrition of economic change, but deliberately, systematically, and over a period of about 100 years, in one of the most sustained acts of deliberate population displacement in modern European history. The Highland clearances are part of Scottish history that does not appear much in the standard tourist narrative of the country, and their absence from that narrative is itself a form of continuing injustice. Between roughly 1750 and 1920, the traditional population of the Scottish Highlands was forcibly removed from its land. The people, who had lived in the glens and on the Machair coasts for generations, were evicted from their homes, often with little or no warning, often with violence or the threat of violence, to make way for sheep farming. The landlords who owned the land, a class that had consolidated its grip on Highland property through a series of legal and political changes that followed the defeat of the Jacobite rising at Culloden in 1746, discovered that a large flock of cheviot or blackface sheep, managed by a small number of shepherds, was more profitable than the traditional small-scale mixed farming economy of the clachans. The evictions happened at different times and different speeds in different parts of the Highlands. Some were relatively small-scale, affecting a single township or glen. Others were large coordinated clearances affecting thousands of people. The most famous are associated with specific landlords, the Countess of Sutherland and her agents, who cleared thousands of people from the interior of Sutherland and resettled some of them on the coast in marginal fishing plots in the first decades of the 19th century. The Gordons of Cluny, who cleared thousands more from South Uist and Barra. The various proprietors of Skye, who cleared large portions of the island at different times through the 19th century. What happened to the cleared people? Many were relocated to coastal strips where they were expected to shift to fishing and kelp harvesting, industries that proved much less reliable than promised. Many emigrated, voluntarily or with landlord assistance, to Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. The Scottish diaspora in these countries, the communities that preserved Gaelic language and Highland culture far from the homeland, exist in large part because of the clearances. The descendants of cleared Highlanders who settled in Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, in the Highland communities of New Zealand's South Island, in the Scottish settlements of the Australian states, number in the millions. Many of them still observe traditions, speak fragments of Gaelic, and maintain connections to the specific places from which their ancestors were removed. The landscape of the Scottish Highlands today is, in many areas, almost entirely a product of the clearances. The empty glens, the ruined cottages, the long views uninterrupted by settlement, the landscape that tourists photograph and describe as primordially wild. Much of this is not natural wilderness. It is the aftermath of forced depopulation. The hills were not always empty, the glens were not always silent. The landscape that now appears timeless and natural is the direct result of a policy decision made in the late 18th and early 19th centuries to prioritize sheep over people. The ruins of the clearance townships are still there, if you know where to look. Stone walls, doorways, the outlines of houses now roofless and collapsing back into the ground. The people who lived in them were not taken by a plague or a famine. They were told to leave by someone who had legal title to the land they had farmed for generations. This history matters for understanding Scotland in the present, because the clearances were the last major act in a much longer process of cultural and social transformation that had been ongoing since the defeat at Culloden. Culloden was the battle in 1746 where the Jacobite army, fighting to restore the Stuart dynasty to the British throne under the leadership of Charles Edward Stuart, known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, was decisively defeated by government forces under the Duke of Cumberland. The battle itself lasted about an hour, The killing continued for much longer. The aftermath of Culloden was the most systematic suppression of a culture that Scotland had ever experienced. The Highland dress, the tartan and the kilt, was banned for nearly 40 years by the Dress Act of 1746. The clan system, the web of kinship and loyalty and mutual obligation that organised Highland society, was systematically dismantled through a series of legal changes that stripped clan chiefs of their traditional legal powers and transformed them from leaders of their people into simply landlords. The Gaelic language was suppressed in education. The traditional Highland way of life, already under economic pressure, was now under political pressure as well. The extraordinary thing is that Highland culture survived, not unchanged, not undiminished, but recognizable. Gaelic survived as a living language, spoken today by about 60,000 people in Scotland, concentrated in the Hebrides and parts of the western mainland. The traditions of music and poetry and storytelling that characterized the Highland cultural tradition found new contexts and new audiences, eventually becoming central to a romanticized Scottish national identity that, while sometimes superficial, preserved real connections to the original culture. The romanticization of Scottish Highlands culture was largely the work of Sir Walter Scott, the early 19th century novelist who more or less invented the modern image of Scotland. Scott's novels, his poems, his organisation of the spectacular royal visit to Edinburgh in 1822, the first visit by a reigning British monarch to Scotland in nearly 2 centuries, transformed Scotland's image both within Britain and internationally. The visit included the first wearing of Highland dress at a royal occasion, with George IV appearing in a kilt that was, by most contemporary accounts, excruciatingly short and accompanied by pink tights to protect his considerable royal dignity from the Scottish weather. Scott's romanticisation of Scotland was simultaneously an act of cultural preservation and cultural distortion. He preserved and popularised traditions that might otherwise have faded entirely, giving them new audiences and new legitimacy at a moment when the culture they came from was under severe pressure. But he also transformed them, smoothing away the rougher edges, filtering out the harder historical realities, presenting a version of Scottish Highland culture that was exciting and romantic and entirely safe for consumption by an Anglophone British and international audience. The Scotland of Waverley and Rob Roy and the Lady of the Lake is a beautiful country, but it is a country with the politics and the pain largely edited out. The real Scotland, the Scotland that existed behind Scott's romanticised version, was simultaneously experiencing one of the most extraordinary intellectual flowerings in modern history. The Scottish Enlightenment is a phenomenon that historians still struggle to fully explain, because its scale and its speed and its influence are genuinely disproportionate to the size and resources of the country that produced it. Between approximately 1730 and 1830, Scotland, a country with a total population that never exceeded 2 million throughout this period, produced a disproportionate share of the foundational ideas of the modern world. The list of what was invented or fundamentally advanced by Scottish thinkers during the Scottish Enlightenment is almost embarrassingly long. Adam Smith, born in Kirkcaldy in Fife in 1723, published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. This book, which laid out the principles of market economics, the division of labour, the self-regulating price mechanism, comparative advantage in trade, is one of the most influential books ever written. The ideas it contains are still being debated, applied, misapplied, and argued over. Essentially, every modern economic system, whether it describes itself as capitalist, socialist, or anything in between, is responding to the framework Smith established. David Hume, born in Edinburgh in 1711, produced a body of philosophical work that is still considered foundational to the discipline. His empiricism, his skepticism about causation, his arguments about the limits of human knowledge, his theory of the passions, his essays on politics and economics and history, collectively constitute one of the most rigorous philosophical systems produced in the modern period. His argument that you cannot derive an ought from an is that moral conclusions cannot be logically derived from factual premises alone, is still one of the most discussed propositions in moral philosophy. Hume was, by his own account and by the account of his contemporaries, a deeply pleasant man, a genial dinner companion, and a ferocious intellectual opponent. James Hutton, born in Edinburgh in 1726, is the founder of modern geology. His theory of the Earth, published in 1788, proposed the idea of deep time, the understanding that the Earth is vastly older than the biblical chronology would suggest, and that the processes that shaped it are the same processes that are operating today, just over incomprehensibly long periods. His phrase that there is no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end, is one of the most consequential sentences in the history of science. It opened a window onto geological time that made Darwin's theory of evolution possible, and that forced a complete reconsideration of the human place in the history of the planet. Hutton's geological work was done partly in the field in Scotland, observing rock formations in the borders and on the coast of Arran, and at the exposed rock face at Syccar Point on the Berwickshire coast. Syccar Point is not a dramatic landscape. It is a modest, rocky shore, but in the rock face there, Hutton and his companions could see with their own eyes the evidence of the vast depth of time, the older vertical layers of rock, overlaid by younger horizontal layers, separated by a surface that represented millions of years of erosion and deposition. Standing at Syccar Point, Hutton's companion John Playfair wrote that the mind seemed to grow giddy by looking so far into the abyss of time. That is exactly the right response. Syccar Point is where the modern understanding of the age of the Earth began, and it is in Scotland, on a coast that looks like 100 other Scottish coasts, unremarkable to the untrained eye. James Watt did not invent the steam engine, and this is worth emphasizing because the standard version of the story, the one about Watt watching the kettle and having a great idea, is wrong in almost every detail. The steam engine existed before Watt. Engines built by Thomas Newcomen were already pumping water out of mines in England before Watt was born. What Watt did was something more precise and more important than inventing the steam engine. He made it work properly. His separate condenser, his sun and planet gear, his double-acting engine design, these innovations transformed the steam engine from an inefficient novelty into a practical power source capable of driving the Industrial Revolution. The precision of Watt's engineering was inseparable from the precision of his thinking, and both were products of his Scottish education and his connections to the network of Scottish scientists, philosophers, and manufacturers who formed the dense intellectual community of the Enlightenment. Watt worked at the University of Glasgow as an instrument maker, which put him in daily contact with the leading scientists of his day and gave him access to a precision culture of measurement and testing that was fundamental to his later innovations. He was more than a mechanic. He was a scientist-engineer in an environment that did not distinguish sharply between those categories. Joseph Black, also working at Glasgow and Edinburgh, discovered latent heat and specific heat, concepts that are foundational to thermodynamics, and without which neither Watt's improvements to the steam engine nor modern chemistry would have been possible. Black's discovery that different substances require different amounts of heat to achieve the same temperature change was intellectually significant. It was practically transformative, providing the theoretical framework for understanding what steam engines were actually doing and how to make them do it more efficiently. William Cullen, John Hunter, Alexander Monro, and the Edinburgh Medical School they built transformed European medicine. The Edinburgh medical curriculum became the model for medical education throughout Britain, the United States, and beyond. Doctors trained in Edinburgh in the 18th century went on to found medical schools and hospitals across the English-speaking world. The prestige of an Edinburgh medical degree was such that wealthy Americans sent their sons there, specifically to be trained by the best physicians in the world. And then there is James Clerk Maxwell, born in Edinburgh in 1831, who did for electromagnetism what Newton had done for mechanics. Maxwell's equations, the four mathematical relationships that describe the behavior of electric and magnetic fields and their interaction, are one of the great achievements of 19th century physics. They predicted the existence of electromagnetic waves and their propagation at the speed of light, a prediction that led directly to the understanding that light itself is an electromagnetic wave, and eventually to the development of radio, television, radar, and essentially all of modern telecommunications. Einstein called Maxwell's work the most significant change in the conception of reality in physics since Newton. That assessment has not been contested. The list keeps going. John Logie Baird, inventor of television; Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone, born in Edinburgh; Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin; Robert Louis Stevenson, who gave the world Treasure Island and Kidnapped, and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a short novel that has generated more literary analysis than most things 10 times its length; Arthur Conan Doyle, who created Sherlock Holmes; Sir Walter Scott, already mentioned; Robert Burns, who wrote the poetry that became the emotional language of Scottish identity and is still quoted at dinner tables around the world on the last night of January every year; John Muir, born in Dunbar, who founded the American National Park movement. Muir's story is worth a moment's pause because it illustrates something important about the Scottish relationship to landscape. He grew up on the coast of East Lothian in the 1840s, in a family that was intensely religious in a Calvinist tradition that emphasized direct engagement with the created world as a form of worship. He emigrated to the United States as a child and eventually made his way to California, where his encounters with the Sierra Nevada transformed him and transformed American thinking about wilderness. His advocacy for the preservation of wild places, his partnership with Theodore Roosevelt, his founding of the Sierra Club, these grew from a set of ideas about the sacred character of the natural world that had roots in the Scottish tradition he was raised in. The National Park System of the United States, the protected wilderness areas that Americans regard as a defining national achievement, has among its intellectual ancestors a boy from the coast of East Lothian who learned to look at the world as something worthy of reverence. The question of why Scotland produced such an extraordinary concentration of intellectual achievement in such a short period is one that historians have been wrestling with for generations without reaching a definitive answer. Several factors are commonly cited. The Scottish educational system, which included a network of parish schools that provided basic literacy to a much larger proportion of the population than was typical in England or France, created a population with higher average educational attainment. The Scottish university system, with its 4 ancient universities at St Andrews, Glasgow, Aberdeen, and Edinburgh, provided advanced education in a context that valued practical application alongside theoretical inquiry. The relative smallness and social density of the Scottish intellectual community meant that the scientists and philosophers and merchants and manufacturers knew each other personally, met in the same clubs, argued in the same coffee houses, and cross-pollinated each other's thinking in ways that larger and more socially stratified communities could not. There is also a political dimension. Scotland had been in union with England since 1707 under the Acts of Union that combined the two kingdoms into Great Britain. For many Scots of the Enlightenment period, the union was a source of both opportunity and anxiety. The English market, the British Empire, the resources and networks of a much larger political entity were now available to Scottish merchants and professionals. But Scotland's distinct identity, its separate legal system, its different church, its different educational tradition, were now under potential pressure from the larger partner in the Union. The Enlightenment can be read partly as an assertion of Scottish distinctiveness, a demonstration that Scotland could compete on the highest intellectual terms with any culture in the world, even as its political independence had been absorbed into the larger British state. The question of Scottish identity and Scottish independence has never been fully resolved. It was not resolved by the Acts of Union in 1707. It was not resolved by the various political and cultural developments of the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, and it is emphatically not resolved today. The referendum on Scottish independence in 2014 produced a result: 55% for remaining in the United Kingdom, 45% for independence, That settled the immediate political question, but not the underlying one. The subsequent British vote to leave the European Union, in which Scotland voted strongly to remain while England voted to leave, has reopened the debate in ways that make the 2014 result look much less final than it did at the time. This is a country that has never quite resolved the question of what it is and where it belongs. It has been part of a larger political entity, Great Britain, for over 3 centuries, and it has maintained a distinct legal system, and a distinct educational system, and a distinct church, and a distinct culture throughout that period. It has contributed enormously to the larger entity of which it is part, while also maintaining a complicated and sometimes resentful relationship with that larger entity. It looks both inward, to its own distinct traditions and history and identity, and outward, to the wider world that Scottish emigrants helped to build. It is a small country with a large historical footprint, and the relationship between those two things has never been entirely comfortable. The mountain that sits at the geographical centre of Scotland, the mountain from which the country's widest views extend in every direction, is called Schiehallion. It is a quartzite cone rising to 3,547 feet above sea level, sitting on the boundary between Perthshire and Rannoch Moor in the Central Highlands. Its name in Scottish Gaelic is Sith Shailean, which means something approximately translatable as the fairy hill of the Caledonians. The fairies in this context are not the small winged creatures of Victorian illustration. They are the Sithaian, the beings of the hollow hills, the other people who inhabit the underground spaces beneath the landscape, who are powerful and unpredictable and who should not be trifled with. The Scythian are a very old presence in Scottish folk belief, and the fact that the geographical centre of Scotland is named after them tells you something about how the pre-modern inhabitants of this land understood the world they lived in. Schiehallion was also, in 1774, the site of a scientific experiment designed to measure the mass of the Earth. The astronomer Royal Neville Maskelyne chose the mountain because its regular conical shape made it possible to calculate its volume, and therefore its mass, more accurately than would be possible with a more irregular mountain. By measuring the deflection of a plumb line at points on either side of the mountain, and comparing the observed deflection with what Newtonian theory predicted given the mountain's estimated mass, Maskelyne and his colleagues were able to calculate the mean density of the Earth, and from that to estimate its total mass. The experiment was successful. The result was within reasonable accuracy of the modern accepted value, and it was done on a mountain whose name translates as the fairy hill of the Caledonians. The contrast between the scientific precision of the Maskelyne experiment and the ancient mythological resonance of the mountain's name is very Scottish. This country does not choose between the rational and the numinous. It holds both at once, sometimes in the same landscape, sometimes in the same person. The souterrains are another example of something Scottish that has not been adequately explained. A souterrain is an underground stone-lined passage, typically entering from a surface building, running for a variable distance underground, and then ending. They date primarily to the Iron Age, roughly from 500 BCE to 500 CE. There are about 300 known souterrains in Scotland, concentrated in the east and north, which broadly overlaps with the territory of the Picts. What were souterrains for? The most common explanation is food storage. The underground environment is cool and dark and maintains a relatively stable temperature throughout the year, which makes it ideal for storing food. Archaeologists have found evidence of food remains in some souterrains. This explanation works for some examples, but not all of them, because some souterrains are very long, sometimes extending for 50 feet or more underground, and some are aligned in ways that suggest they may have had astronomical functions, with their entrances oriented to receive light at specific times of year. Some have architectural features, carved stones, decorated jambs, that go well beyond what you would expect for a simple food store. The possibility that souterrains had ritual or ceremonial functions, that they were not simply refrigerators but also spaces where contact with the underground world could be made, is consistent with what we know about the cosmological beliefs of the Iron Age cultures that built them. The underground was more than a practical resource in these cosmologies. It was a different world, a world of the dead, of the ancestors, of powers that could help or harm the living. Building a passage down into that world and maintaining it as a feature of your household architecture may have been as much about maintaining a relationship with what lay below as about keeping your vegetables cold. This is speculation, but it is informed speculation. The archaeological evidence is genuinely ambiguous, and the ambiguity is itself telling. The people who built the brooks and the souterrains and the Pictish symbol stones and the crannogs were doing things for reasons that made complete sense to them, and that we can only partially recover. The deeper we dig, the more we find. The more we find, the more complicated the picture becomes. The Lewis chessmen are perhaps the most famous objects ever found in Scotland that no one can fully explain. They were discovered in 1831 on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, buried in a sand dune near the beach at Uig on the west coast of the island. Exactly how they were found, and by whom, is not entirely clear, because the accounts differ, and the finder or finders had reasons to be less than completely transparent about the circumstances of discovery. Given the complications of treasure lore, what is certain is that at least 78 individual pieces of carved walrus, ivory and whale tooth were found at this location, including chess pieces of several types, and a number of additional pieces whose exact function is uncertain. The Lewis chessmen are medieval chess sets, or rather parts of chess sets, carved in the 12th century CE, almost certainly in Norway or by craftspeople working in the Norwegian tradition. They depict kings, queens, bishops, knights, rooks, and pawns, with the rooks represented as warriors biting their shields in a pose reminiscent of the Norse berserker tradition. The carving is of exceptional quality. The expressions on the faces of the pieces are individualized and sometimes deeply expressive. The queen in one of the sets looks as if she is contemplating something she would rather not have to deal with. The expression is recognizably human in a way that medieval art frequently is not, and it has made the Lewis chessmen among the most beloved objects in the collections of the British Museum and the National Museum of Scotland, which jointly hold the pieces. But the question of why a collection of 12th century Norse chess sets was buried in a sand dune on the west coast of Lewis has never been definitively answered. The most common explanation is that they were the stock of a merchant travelling between Norway and Ireland who buried them for safekeeping and never returned to retrieve them. This is plausible. The western sea routes between Norway and Ireland, via Orkney and the Hebrides, were well established in the 12th century. A merchant carrying valuable goods along this route might well stop at Lewis, and might well find reason to conceal his stock temporarily. But why Lewis specifically? Why that particular sand dune? And why were the pieces never recovered? If the merchant died, someone should have known where his goods were hidden. If he was captured or enslaved, the location of the cache might not have been retrievable. If the concealment was not for commercial reasons but for some other purpose, religious, political, personal, the reasons for its permanence might be quite different. The Lewis chessmen have been sitting in their respective museum cases for nearly 2 centuries now, and they are not telling. The Rosslyn Chapel outside Edinburgh is a building that has attracted an extraordinary amount of theory and speculation, not all of it well grounded. Built in the mid-15th century by Sir William Sinclair, 3rd Earl of Orkney, as a collegiate chapel intended to provide perpetual prayer for the souls of the Sinclair family, it is architecturally extraordinary in a way that is not fully explained by its stated purpose. The interior stone carving is of a richness and complexity that goes well beyond what you would expect for a family chapel, even a wealthy family chapel. Every surface is covered with carved decoration, and much of that decoration is strange. The green man appears repeatedly in the carvings, the foliate head with vegetation growing from its mouth, a pre-Christian symbol that appears throughout medieval European architecture but with unusual density at Rosslyn. There are carvings that appear to show plants that were not known in Europe at the time the chapel was built. Plants that look like aloe vera and maize, which was a North American crop not known in Europe before the late 15th century, and Rosslyn was built before Columbus's voyage. This observation, if accurate, is deeply puzzling. The usual explanations, that the carvings are stylized enough that the resemblance is coincidental, or that the masons were working from earlier patterns whose origins are unknown, are not entirely satisfying. The Sinclair family history adds another layer of complexity. They were associated, through family tradition and through some documentary evidence, with the Knights Templar, the crusading military order that was suppressed by the King of France in 1307. Scotland was one of the few places in Europe where Templars were not prosecuted following the suppression, partly because the Scottish Church at that time was in conflict with Rome and not inclined to cooperate with papal instructions, and partly because Robert the Bruce, who was fighting for Scottish independence at the time, was not in a position to turn away experienced military men. What happened to the Templars who came to Scotland is not clearly documented, but the Sinclair connection to their tradition is plausible enough to have generated extensive speculation. The Apprentice Pillar, one of the most extraordinary pieces of stone carving in Scotland, stands in the corner of Rosslyn Chapel's nave. It is covered with spiralling bands of carved stone foliage that wind around the column from base to capital, carved with a technical virtuosity that is hard to look at without wondering how anyone did this. The story associated with it, that the master mason left for Rome to seek a design, and while he was away his apprentice carved the column, and when the master returned and saw it, he killed the apprentice in a rage of jealousy, is almost certainly a legend invented later to explain an extraordinary piece of work, but it is the right kind of legend, the kind that exists because the object it describes is genuinely extraordinary enough to require an explanation. The Clava cairns are a group of prehistoric monuments found only in the vicinity of Inverness, in a region roughly bounded by the Moray Firth to the north and the Great Glen to the south and west. They are Bronze Age burial monuments dating to roughly 4,000 years ago, and they exist in two distinct types: ring cairns, which are hollow circular enclosures without a central chamber, and passage cairns, which are solid circular mounds with a central burial chamber accessed by a stone-lined passage. Both types are surrounded by a stone circle, with the standing stones graded in height so that the tallest are in the southwest and the shortest in the northeast. The orientation of the passage cairns is consistent. They face southwest, toward the setting sun at the midwinter solstice. On the midwinter solstice, the sun sets in exactly the direction that the passages face, and the last light of the shortest day shines directly into the burial chamber. This is the same principle as Maeshowe in Orkney, the same desire to connect the burial place of the dead with the astronomical cycle of the year. But the Clava cairns are concentrated in a relatively small area, their design is unique, and their astronomy is notably consistent across the group. What is particularly strange about the Clava cairns is their cup marks, cup-shaped depressions, ground into the surfaces of many of the stones, some on the tops of curbstones and standing stones, some on surfaces that would have been invisible after the cairn was constructed. The cup marks were clearly not meant to be seen in all cases. Some of them face inward, into the body of the cairn, carved on surfaces that would have been buried as soon as construction was complete. Someone carved them knowing they would never be seen again. This is not unusual in prehistoric contexts. Archaeologists have found similar examples of carving in places that would immediately be covered up, on the back faces of standing stones, on internal faces of burial chamber walls, in positions that rule out any communicative or decorative function. The most common interpretation is that the carving itself was the important thing, the act of making the marks, rather than the marks being seen. This implies a belief system in which the physical act of inscription had power, regardless of whether anyone could read or see the result. You carved the stone because carving it mattered, not because anyone would ever look at it. This idea, that the act of creation has power independent of its social reception, is not foreign to modern religious or artistic thinking. People write letters they never send. People carve their names in places no one will see. People perform rituals whose outward form is entirely private. What is strange in the context of the cup marks is not the impulse but the systematic nature of it. The fact that people across a wide territory consistently chose to carve marks on surfaces they knew would be hidden over a period of many centuries. The Clava cairns at Balnuaran of Clava, southeast of Inverness, are the best preserved and most visited. Standing in the passage cairn at Balnuaran on the midwinter solstice, as the sun sinks toward the southwest and sends its last light down the passage and into the chamber, is one of the most powerful experiences the Scottish landscape offers. The light comes in at a low angle, glowing orange on the chamber walls. The stones are covered in cut marks. The silence of the field around you is absolute, and you are aware, very specifically, that this experience was created deliberately by people who died 4,000 years ago. They built this so that this would happen. The light, the silence, the warmth on the stones, they made it possible for you to stand here and feel this. The connection across 4,000 years is entirely real, because they built it. Scotland's genetic history is as layered and complex as its archaeological and cultural history. Modern genetic analysis has revealed that the Scottish population carries traces of every major migration event in the history of the British Isles, and some that were specific to Scotland. The earliest genetic signature, which persists in some parts of Scotland, particularly in the Hebrides and the far north, comes from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who arrived after the ice. This signature is ancient, but it is detectable. It is the genetic trace of the first people to walk on Scottish soil after the glaciers left. The Neolithic farmers who arrived around 6,000 years ago added a different genetic signature, derived from populations in the Middle East and southeastern Europe who had adopted farming and migrated westward over thousands of years. As we have already discussed, this population was then largely replaced by the incoming Beaker people around 4,500 years ago, who carried a steppe ancestry that is now the dominant genetic component in most British and Irish populations. The Iron Age Celts, the people whose languages gave rise to the Scottish Gaelic and Welsh and Irish languages still spoken today, added further genetic components derived from Central and Western Europe. The Romans, despite their presence in southern Scotland for several centuries, left a genetic signature that is very difficult to detect, probably because their interaction with the indigenous population was limited to military zones and trading settlements. The Norse contribution to Scottish genetics is substantial in specific regions. The Shetland and Orkney Islands, which were under Norwegian rule until 1469, when they were pledged to Scotland as a dowry payment for the marriage of Margaret of Denmark to James III of Scotland, and were never actually redeemed, have populations with the highest proportion of Scandinavian ancestry in the British Isles outside of Scandinavia itself. In Shetland, the Scandinavian genetic contribution in some communities exceeds 50%. The Norn language, a form of Old Norse, was spoken in Orkney and Shetland until the 18th century. The place names of the Northern Isles are overwhelmingly Norse in origin. The landscape itself, the vaux and the sounds and the eyes, speaks Norse. The Gaelic-speaking Western Seaboard has a different genetic signature, reflecting the historical connections across the North Channel with Ireland and the relative isolation of the island and peninsular communities from the migrations that affected the lowland and eastern populations. Certain communities in the Western Isles retain distinctive genetic profiles that reflect centuries of relative endogamy, marrying within a relatively small pool of related families, which is itself partly a product of the geographic isolation of island life. The genetic complexity of the Scottish population is a record of every movement and invasion and migration and settlement that the country has experienced over 12,000 years. It is a record written in human bodies rather than in stone or ink, and it is being read more precisely with every passing year as ancient DNA analysis becomes more sophisticated. The question of Gaelic is one that has been argued about for generations in Scotland, and that involves far more than linguistics. Gaelic is currently spoken by approximately 63,000 people in Scotland, which represents about 1.1% of the population. The number is small, and it has been declining for centuries, but it has stabilized somewhat in recent decades as a result of government support, Gaelic medium education, Gaelic broadcasting through the television channel BBC Alba, and a broader cultural recognition of the language's significance to Scottish identity. The specific geography of Gaelic survival is instructive. The language is strongest in the Outer Hebrides, particularly in Lewis and Harris, and North Uist and South Uist and Barra. These are the islands where Gaelic was the community language throughout the period of its decline elsewhere, where it was the language of the home and the church and the sealage, where it was passed from parent to child without interruption, even through the clearances and the educational suppression of the 19th century. The eastern mainland of Scotland, which in the medieval period was substantially Gaelic-speaking, has been almost entirely anglicised. The Gaelic place names survive. Aber, meaning confluence of rivers, appears in Aberdeen and Aberfoyle and Aberfeldy. Glen, meaning valley, appears in hundreds of place names throughout the country. Ben, meaning mountain, appears in Ben Nevis and Ben Lomond and hundreds of others. But the language itself is gone from the lowlands and the east, replaced by Scots, a Germanic language derived from the Northumbrian dialect of Old English, and then by Standard English. The survival of Gaelic in the Western Isles through all the pressures of the last 3 centuries is itself an extraordinary story. It survived the systematic suppression of the 19th century education system, where children were punished for speaking Gaelic at school. It survived the clearances, which removed large portions of the Gaelic-speaking population from their land. It survived the 2 world wars, which took disproportionate numbers of young men from the island communities. It survived the economic pressures that have led to significant emigration from the islands throughout the 20th century. The language is fragile, and the communities that sustain it are under continuing pressure from economic forces that are very difficult to resist. But it is alive, and as long as it is alive, it carries within it a way of seeing and naming and understanding the Scottish landscape that goes back to the earliest Gaelic speakers on this land. The Sealid, the traditional Gaelic gathering for music and storytelling and dancing, is the social form through which the Gaelic tradition was transmitted. A Sealid is not primarily a performance, it is a communal event in which everyone participates to the best of their ability. The stories told, the songs sung, the tunes played, the dances danced, are all part of a tradition that extends back centuries, adapting and changing with each generation while maintaining recognizable connections to the past. The tradition of oral poetry in Gaelic, the bardic tradition of the courts of the medieval Gaelic lords, survived in modified form long after the courts themselves disappeared, carried by individual families who maintained the tradition as a matter of cultural pride and obligation. The Gaelic musical tradition of Scotland, particularly the music of the bagpipes, is one of the most distinctive musical traditions in the world. The Great Highland Bagpipe, which is what most people mean when they say bagpipes, is a relatively recent development in the long history of piping in Scotland, reaching its current form in the 17th century. But the tradition of wind instruments in Scotland is ancient. The chanter, the melody pipe of the bagpipe, is derived from instruments that were widespread throughout Europe in the medieval period and that have roots going back much further. Pibroch, the classical music of the Highland bagpipe, is one of the most demanding and least understood musical forms in any tradition. It is built on a theme and a series of variations, each variation more complex than the last, requiring a level of technical skill and musical intelligence that takes years to develop. Pibroch was the music of the court piper, the musician employed by a clan chief to provide music for important occasions and to compose pieces commemorating significant events, battles, deaths, weddings, the arrival of honoured guests. The Pibroch tradition continued through the clearances and the suppression of Highland culture, carried by individual pipers and the families that trained them, and it survives today as a living performance tradition, taught and contested and composed. Whiskey is the word in Scottish Gaelic from which the drink takes its name, Uisge Beatha, the water of life. The distillation of whiskey in Scotland has been documented since the 15th century, though the practice is certainly older. The first recorded reference to Scotch whiskey appears in the Scottish Exchequer Rolls of 1494, where there is an entry recording the purchase of malt from which aqua vitae was to be made for King James IV. Aqua vitae is the Latin equivalent of Uisge Beatha. The king was buying whiskey. The geography of Scottish whiskey production is inseparable from the geography of Scotland itself. The water that flows through Scottish rivers and streams picks up the character of the rocks it flows over, acquiring trace minerals and qualities that affect the flavour of spirits made from it. The peat, the partially decomposed vegetation that underlies much of the Scottish upland landscape, burns in a particular way and imparts particular flavours to malt that has been dried over peat fires. The different regions of Scotland, Speyside, Islay, Campbelltown, the Highlands, the Lowlands, produce whiskies with distinct characters that reflect the specific geology and climate and water of those regions. The island of Islay, at the southern end of the Hebrides, produces whiskies that are famous for their intensely peaty, smoky character, derived from the massive peat bogs that cover much of the island and provide the fuel for drying the malt. The distilleries on Islay, Lagavulin and Laphroaig and Ardbeg and Bowmore and several others make spirits that are divisive in the way that genuinely distinct things always are. People either love them or find them difficult. There is no neutral response to a very peaty Islay whisky. The peat has been accumulating on Islay for thousands of years, layer by layer, millennium by millennium, and a glass of Islay single malt contains, in some small chemical way, the accumulation of all that time. Speyside, the region centred on the River Spey in the northeast of Scotland, produces whiskies of a very different character, typically lighter and more elegant, with fruit and honey notes and less emphasis on peat. The concentration of distilleries in Speyside is extraordinary. Within a relatively small area, there are more distilleries than in any comparable area in the world. The Spey Valley has been producing whiskey commercially since at least the 18th century, and many of the distilleries that operate today have histories going back 200 years or more. The economics of Scotch whiskey are substantial. Scotland exports more whiskey than any other country in the world, and the value of those exports represents a significant portion of Scottish economic output. But the cultural significance of whiskey goes well beyond economics. It is a product that carries within it an extraordinary amount of Scottish history and geography. The grain grown on Scottish farms, the water from Scottish rivers and springs, the peat cut from Scottish uplands, the oak barrels in which the spirit matures, often for many years, sometimes for decades, the distillery buildings that were constructed in a specific period with a specific purpose, and that have often been maintained and operated continuously since. All of these elements combine to make a bottle of Scotch whisky a remarkably dense object. Opening one and pouring a glass is, if you are disposed to think about it that way, an act of connection with a very long history. The story of Scottish independence, or more precisely of the series of attempts to achieve or maintain Scottish independence, runs through the entire history of the country since the political union with England began to be a realistic possibility in the late medieval period. The most famous chapter of that story involves Robert the Bruce and the Battle of Bannockburn. The background is this. Scotland had been an independent kingdom since at least the 9th century, with a continuous line of kings traceable from Kenneth MacAlpin. In the late 13th century, the Scottish succession became disputed following the death of Margaret, Maid of Norway, the young queen who was the last direct descendant of the main line. The competing claimants to the throne, of whom John Balliol and Robert Bruce the Elder were the most serious, agreed to accept the arbitration of the English king Edward I. Edward I, known to history as Hammer of the Scots, a title he apparently gave himself and that subsequent history has confirmed as appropriate in its description of his attitude towards Scotland, used the opportunity to assert English overlordship over Scotland and then to press that overlordship into outright conquest. John Balliol was installed as king but eventually defied Edward. Edward invaded, removed Balliol, removed the Stone of Destiny from Scone, the coronation stone of Scottish kings, and took it to Westminster, where it remained until 1996. He appointed English administrators to govern Scotland. He expected the matter to be settled. It was not settled. William Wallace, a knight from Renfrewshire about whom remarkably little is reliably known despite his enormous fame, organised Scottish resistance and led the Scottish forces to a stunning victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, where the English army was caught crossing a bridge and attacked before it could deploy properly. The English force was large and experienced, and it was cut to pieces by a much smaller Scottish army. Wallace was appointed Guardian of Scotland. He was ultimately captured and executed in 1305, killed with a brutality that reflected both the seriousness with which the English took the Scottish threat and the particular fury that Edward I toward the man who had embarrassed his army. But the resistance continued. Robert Bruce, grandson of the original claimant, who had a complicated political history involving changing sides more than once in the conflict between Scotland and England, was crowned King of Scots in 1306. Within a few months, his forces were scattered and he was a fugitive, and this is where the spider appears. The story of Bruce and the spider is one of the most famous in Scottish history. Hiding somewhere, the cave where this happened is claimed by multiple locations in Scotland and Ireland. Dispirited and on the point of giving up, Bruce watched a spider attempting to swing from one surface to another to build its web. The spider failed repeatedly. It kept trying. Eventually it succeeded. Bruce drew the obvious lesson from this and renewed his campaign. The historical reliability of this story is zero. There is no contemporary account of it. The earliest version appears in the 14th century, after Bruce's death. It is almost certainly a legend created to explain and celebrate his persistence in the face of apparent defeat. But the reason the story has lasted 700 years is that it captures something true about what the historical Bruce actually did. He was a man who failed repeatedly and kept going. He fought against long odds for years, building alliances, recruiting forces, winning small victories, and eventually winning a very large one. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Bruce's Scottish army defeated a much larger English force sent to relieve the besieged Stirling Castle, is the most famous Scottish military victory in history. The English army, under Edward II, was numerically superior and better equipped. The Scottish army used the terrain and their own discipline and the mistakes of their opponents to devastating effect over 2 days of fighting. The English retreat became a rout. Edward II escaped on horseback. The English pursuit of Scottish sovereignty was broken, though not ended, by Bannockburn. The Declaration of Arbroath, the letter sent to the Pope in 1320, asserting the independence of Scotland and the right of Scots to resist any king, even their own, who threatened their freedom, was drafted 7 years later. The Declaration of Arbroath is one of the great documents of medieval political thought. It contains a passage that has been quoted in arguments about liberty and independence for 700 years. Even were our king to subject us to the English, we would resist and choose a new king, for we fight not for glory, riches, or honours, but for liberty alone, which no worthy man loses but with his life. The document was addressed to the Pope and written in Latin by clerics who were familiar with the legal and theological arguments of the day. Its ideas about the relationship between rulers and the people they rule, and about the right of resistance to tyranny, are genuinely advanced for the period. Some historians have argued that the Declaration of Arbroath influenced, at some remove through the political thought it contributed to, the American Declaration of Independence. The argument is not absurd, though the chain of influence is long and indirect. Scottish independence was achieved and maintained under Bruce and his successors, though never with complete security, for another 3 centuries. The union with England came eventually not through conquest, but through inheritance. James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, following the death of Elizabeth I without an heir. A Scottish king sat on the English throne. The two kingdoms remained legally distinct for another century, until the Acts of Union of 1707 merged the parliaments and created the United Kingdom of Great Britain. The political union of 1707 was controversial from the beginning and has remained controversial. The Scottish Parliament voted for the union after extensive negotiation and, many Scots believed at the time and have believed since, after extensive bribery of the Scottish commissioners by English gold. Robert Burns, writing almost a century later, put the sentiment bluntly: "We're bought and sold for English gold, such a parcel of rogues in a nation. Whether the accusation of bribery is fair or not, the union was not popular in Scotland, and popular unrest followed it for several decades, culminating in the Jacobite risings." The Jacobite risings were attempts to restore the Stuart dynasty to the British throne. The Stuarts, the family of James VI and I, had been removed from the English throne in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when the Protestant William of Orange was invited to take the throne in place of the Catholic James VII and II. Scotland had its own version of this revolution, and the Stuart cause, the Jacobite cause, found consistent support in the Catholic and Episcopalian communities of Scotland and in the Highlands, where the clan chiefs maintained personal loyalty to the Stuart line. The 45, the Jacobite Rising of 1745, led by Charles Edward Stuart, the Young Pretender, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, is the most famous. Charles landed in the Outer Hebrides in July 1745 with 7 companions, raised the standard at Glenfinnan, attracted an army of Highland clans to his cause, marched south to Edinburgh, defeated an English force at the Battle of Prestonpans, continued south into England as far as Derby, and then, when the expected English Jacobite support failed to materialise, turned back north. The retreat ended at Culloden. Culloden on the 16th of April 1746 was a disaster for the Jacobites. The battle lasted less than an hour. The Jacobite army, already weakened by the winter campaign and attacking across ground that was entirely unsuitable for their style of fighting, was cut down by government artillery and musket fire. The dead numbered in the thousands. The wounded were mostly killed where they lay. And then the government forces, under the Duke of Cumberland, who would acquire the nickname Butcher for his role in the aftermath, spent weeks hunting down Jacobite survivors and supporters throughout the Highlands. Culloden ended the Jacobite cause as a realistic military and political proposition. It also ended, effectively, the traditional Highland way of life as it had existed for centuries. The systematic dismantling of the clan system that followed Culloden, the prohibition of Highland dress, the prosecution of those who had supported the rising, the beginning of the demographic and economic changes that would lead eventually to the clearances, all flow from that damp afternoon on Drumossie Moor. The battlefield at Culloden is now a heritage site managed by the National Trust for Scotland. The graves of the clans, mass graves marked with simple stones bearing the clan names, are still there. The flags that mark the positions of the opposing armies have been placed in the ground. The visitor centre is designed to be informative without being celebratory, because there is nothing to celebrate about Culloden. It is a place of defeat and grief and the end of things. Visiting it is a quiet and sobering experience. The moorland is wide and flat, and the wind is usually cold. The stones are simple. The names on them are the names of the families that contributed most of the dead. MacDonald, Clan Chatton, Fraser, Cameron, Stewart. The government graves are marked separately. The Darien scheme was Scotland's most catastrophic collective failure, and understanding it is important for understanding why the Acts of Union of 1707 happened the way they did and why they were accepted, however reluctantly, by a Scottish Parliament that might otherwise have been expected to resist them more effectively. In the 1690s, Scotland was in serious economic difficulty. The country had been severely affected by a series of failed harvests. There were significant debts, and the restrictions on Scottish trade imposed by English mercantile legislation were strangling Scottish commercial development. A scheme was proposed and enthusiastically adopted to found a Scottish colony on the Isthmus of Panama at a location called Darien, which the promoters believed would be the perfect site for a trading post, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific coasts and capturing the trade of both oceans. The scheme attracted investment from a substantial proportion of the available capital in Scotland. Estimates suggest that something between a quarter and a half of all the money in Scotland was invested in the Company of Scotland and its Darien project. 2,000 colonists set sail in 1698 in 5 ships. They landed at Darien, which the promoters had described as a paradise, and found a malarial swamp. The indigenous population was not interested in trading with them. The Spanish claimed the territory. The English government, under orders from William III, who did not want to antagonize Spain, refused to provide any assistance. The English colonies in the Americas were instructed not to trade with or support the Darien settlers. The colony failed catastrophically. Disease killed hundreds. The survivors were forced to abandon the settlement. A second expedition, sent without knowing the first had failed, also ended in disaster. Of the 2,500 people who sailed to Darien, about 300 returned alive. Scotland had lost a large fraction of its available capital, thousands of lives, and any realistic prospect of becoming an independent colonial power. The economic devastation of the Darien disaster was one of the most important factors that made the Acts of Union politically possible 7 years later. Scotland was bankrupt, or close to it. England offered economic terms in the Union, including compensation for the Darien losses, that were difficult to refuse. Whether those terms fully compensated for political independence is a debate that has been going on for 300 years and is not getting any more settled. The Scotland that entered the Union in 1707 was simultaneously a country that had just suffered one of its worst economic disasters and a country on the verge of one of the greatest intellectual flowerings in modern history. The Scottish Enlightenment that was already beginning to stir in the early 18th century would within a few decades make Scotland one of the most intellectually productive places on earth. The poverty of the Darien aftermath and the prosperity of the Enlightenment period happened in the same country within a few decades of each other, which tells you something about the resilience and the contradictions of Scotland. Mary, Queen of Scots, is the figure who attracts the most romantic historical attention in the entire Scottish story, and it is possible to spend many hours examining her life and finding it as strange and as tragic as the most elaborate fiction. She became Queen of Scotland at 6 days old when her father James V died in 1542. She was sent to France at age 5 to be raised at the French court and married to the French Dauphin, becoming Queen of France at 16 when her husband became Francis II. He died of an ear infection 2 years later, and Mary, now a widow and no longer Queen of France, returned to Scotland in 1561. What she returned to was a Scotland that had experienced, in her absence, a Protestant Reformation of considerable violence and thoroughness. John Knox, who had been trained in the Calvinist tradition in Geneva under John Calvin himself, had returned to Scotland and was driving a religious transformation that would eventually produce the Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian tradition that is still Scotland's largest church. Mary was a Catholic. Her kingdom was rapidly becoming Protestant. The intersection of these facts with her personal life, her second marriage to Lord Darnley, who was probably a fool, his probable involvement in the murder of her secretary Rizzio, his own subsequent murder in suspicious circumstances in which Mary may or may not have been complicit, her extremely rapid third marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, who was widely suspected of murdering Darnley, produced a political crisis that ended in her forced abdication and imprisonment in 1567. She escaped from Lochleven Castle and raised an army, was defeated, and fled to England, where she threw herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth I. Elizabeth, who faced her own political complications in that Mary was the Catholic heir to the English throne and represented a focus for Catholic opposition to the Protestant English settlement, kept Mary under house arrest for 19 years before finally authorizing her execution in 1587. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, at Fotheringhay Castle is one of the most dramatic scenes in the history of the British Isles, described by eyewitnesses in detail, that has lost none of its power over 4 centuries. Mary dressed in crimson, the colour of Catholic martyrdom. She removed her outer clothing to reveal the red beneath. She forgave the executioner. She placed her head on the block. The first blow was not clean. The second removed the head. As the executioner held up the head to display it to the assembled witnesses, her small dog, which had been hidden beneath her skirts, crept forward and lay beside the body and refused to be removed. After her execution, Mary became something she had never quite managed to be while alive. A symbol of Catholic resistance, of female sovereignty, of romantic tragedy, of Scotland's complicated relationship with England. Her son James, who became James VI of Scotland and then James I of England, was the child she had been separated from and had not seen for 20 years when she died. He did not apparently grieve much. He went on to become one of the most significant monarchs in British history, commissioning the King James Bible, surviving the Gunpowder Plot, writing extensively on the theory of monarchy, and eventually uniting the crowns of Scotland and England. The Pictish symbol stones are still being found. New ones turn up occasionally when fields are ploughed or construction work begins or riverbanks erode. The known corpus of over 200 stones is regularly examined by new analytical techniques, new pattern recognition algorithms, new approaches borrowed from linguistics and information theory. None of them have cracked the symbols. The most that can be said with confidence is that the symbols were meaningful, that their combinations followed rules, and that those rules are not yet understood. There is something deeply appropriate about the fact that Scotland's most distinctive artistic tradition cannot be read. The Picts, who were by any measure a sophisticated and successful people, chose to express something important to them in a visual language that has outlasted any possibility of translation. Whatever they were trying to say, they said it in a form that has proved absolutely durable. The stones are still here. The message is still on them. It is just that the code died with the people who could read it, and no amount of technological sophistication has yet brought it back. The same quality of durable illegibility applies to a surprising amount of Scottish prehistory. The cut marks on the stones, the orientation of the souterrains, the specific design choices of the broch builders, the arrangement of the clava cairns, the symbols on the Pictish stones. Scotland is a country full of things that were clearly important and that have not explained themselves. The people who made them knew exactly what they meant. We do not. This is not a unique situation. Most of what happened in most of the world before written records is irretrievable in the sense of interior meaning. We can map the distributions and measure the alignments and analyze the chemistry and reconstruct the technologies. But the meanings, the beliefs, the stories, the specific understanding of why a particular stone should be placed in a particular position at a particular orientation, these are gone with the people who held them. Scotland simply has an unusually rich and unusually well-preserved collection of such things, partly because of its geology, which provides excellent building material, and in many places excellent preservation conditions, and partly because it was never thoroughly Romanized, which means that the early medieval overlay that obliterated so much prehistoric material in southern Britain is thinner here. The Orkney Islands, which we have already visited in the Neolithic period, continued to be historically significant in ways that most people are not aware of. They were Norse territory from the 9th century until 1468. The Earldom of Orkney was a Norse institution, granted by the King of Norway to powerful Norse families. The Earls of Orkney were major political players in the Norse world, appearing in the sagas, warring with Norwegian kings, raiding the Scottish mainland, negotiating with Scottish kings. The Orkneyinga saga, the saga of the Orkney Earls, is one of the great Norse sagas, a narrative covering 4 centuries of the earldom's history, with all the complexity and violence and occasional dark humour that characterize the genre. The most famous of the Orkney Earls is Magnus Erlendsson, who was killed in 1117 in circumstances that were interpreted by the Church as martyrdom. Magnus was a man of unusual religious scruples who, according to the saga, refused to fight in a Viking raid because he believed the raid was unjust, and who was killed by his co-earl Hakon in a political dispute. The Church canonized him as Saint Magnus, and the Cathedral of Saint Magnus in Kirkwall, built in the 12th century and still standing and still in use as an active cathedral, was dedicated to him. The cathedral, built in the Romanesque style from local red sandstone, is one of the finest medieval buildings in Scotland and one of the most complete medieval churches in the British Isles. Most medieval churches were substantially altered or rebuilt in subsequent centuries. St. Magnus Cathedral has survived exceptionally intact. Within the cathedral, embedded in 2 pillars, are the bones of a man and a woman, placed there when the pillars were opened during restoration work in the 20th century. The man's skull bears a large cleft wound consistent with the description in the Orkneyinga saga of how Magnus was killed, an axe blow to the head. The bones may be those of Magnus himself. If they are, then the cathedral still contains the physical remains of the man it was built to honour, nearly 9 centuries after his death. The geology of Scotland's west coast is some of the most dramatic in the world. The sea locks that cut deep into the highland landscape, Loch Fyne, Loch Long, Loch Etive, Loch Linhay, are drowned glacial valleys, carved by ice, and then flooded by the rising sea at the end of the last glaciation. They are flanked by mountains of extraordinary character, rocky and heathered, rising steeply from the water's edge. The light on a Scottish west coast evening, when the sun is setting over the islands and the lochs are reflecting the pink and gold of the sky, is one of the most beautiful things that weather and geology can produce. The Knoydart Peninsula, sometimes called the last wilderness in Scotland, is one of the most remote inhabited places in Britain. There is no road to Knoydart. You reach it by boat from Mallaig, or you walk in over the mountains, which takes at least a day in good conditions. The village of Inverie, the only settlement, has a small population, a post office, a pub that claims to be the most remote on the British mainland, and a wide, striking view across Loch Nevis to the mountains beyond. The peninsula was almost entirely cleared of its population in the 19th century. The remaining community organised itself into a land trust in 1999 and bought the estate from its private owner, becoming one of the first communities in Scotland to exercise the community buyout rights that subsequent legislation has extended to other communities. The community land movement in Scotland, of which the Knoydart buyout was an early example, is one of the most significant social developments in contemporary Scotland. Over the past 3 decades, the proportion of Scottish land owned by communities rather than private landowners has grown substantially, reversing to some degree the pattern of concentrated land ownership that the clearances entrenched. Scotland still has some of the most concentrated land ownership in Europe, with a significant proportion of the highland and island landscape owned by relatively few individuals and institutions. But the community land movement has demonstrated that alternative models are viable, and it has restored to at least some communities a degree of control over their land that their ancestors lost in the clearances. The Forth Rail Bridge, opened in 1890, is one of the great engineering achievements of the Victorian age and one of the great symbols of Scotland's industrial capacity. It spans the Firth of Forth at Queensferry, carrying the main East Coast Railway line between Edinburgh and Dundee. It is a cantilever bridge of massive scale, built from steel, painted red, illuminated at night, and recognisable from photographs to people who have never visited Scotland. It has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2015. The bridge was built in response to a catastrophe. The first rail crossing of the Firth of Tay, which opens into the Firth of Forth from the north, was the Tay Bridge, a lattice girder structure completed in 1878. On the 28th of December 1879, during a severe storm, the central girders of the Tay Bridge collapsed while a passenger train was crossing it. 75 people died. The cause was determined to be a combination of inadequate design and poor construction and maintenance, exacerbated by the extreme wind loading of the storm. The designer, Sir Thomas Booch, who had already received a knighthood for the bridge and was drawing up plans for a bridge across the Forth, was ruined professionally and died within a year. The Forth Rail Bridge was designed by engineers John Fowler and Benjamin Baker, who approached the problem with a rigorous attention to structural analysis that was a direct response to the Tay Bridge disaster. The cantilever design they chose distributes the load in a way that is inherently stable and that can resist the kind of dynamic loading that destroyed the Tay Bridge. The construction took 7 years and employed about 4,500 workers, of whom 57 were killed. When it was completed, it was the longest bridge in the world. It held that record for several years. The bridge has been continuously maintained since its completion. The painting of the Forth Bridge became proverbially associated with a task that never ends. And while the modern paint systems used today do not require quite such continuous attention as the older paint did, the bridge does require constant maintenance. There is a permanent team dedicated to its upkeep. The structure is in excellent condition. It will probably outlast everything built in Scotland in the 20th century. Edinburgh Castle sits on a volcanic plug, the solidified core of a volcano that was active in the Carboniferous period, about 340 million years ago. The surrounding softer rock was eroded by glaciers and weathered away, leaving the hard basalt core standing as a natural defensive position that has been used for human habitation for at least 3,000 years. The oldest building on the rock, the Chapel of St. Margaret, dates to the 12th century. It is the oldest surviving building in Edinburgh. The castle itself has been added to and modified through every century since, making it an architectural accumulation that reflects over 800 years of Scottish history. The Scottish crown jewels, the honours of Scotland, are kept in the castle. They are the oldest crown jewels in the British Isles. The crown itself was refurbished in 1540 by order of James V, incorporating an older crown, possibly the one worn at the coronation of Robert the Bruce in 1306. The sceptre was a gift from Pope Alexander VI to James IV in 1494. The sword was a gift from Pope Julius II to James IV in 1507. These objects, which have been used at every Scottish coronation and are among the most significant historic objects in Scotland, were hidden under the floor of Dunatar Castle during the Commonwealth period when Cromwellian forces occupied Scotland, smuggled out by the wife of the local minister, and eventually returned after the Restoration. They were locked in a chest in Edinburgh Castle in 1707, following the Acts of Union, and were forgotten, or at least not looked for over a century, until Sir Walter Scott organised a search and had them rediscovered in 1818, still in the chest where they had been placed in 1707. The Stone of Destiny, also known as the Stone of Scone, has a more complicated history. This large sandstone block was the stone on which Scottish kings were traditionally crowned at Scone, near Perth. It was taken to Westminster by Edward I in 1296 and used as part of the English coronation throne, where English and then British monarchs were crowned while sitting above it. It was returned to Scotland in 1996 by the then Conservative government and is now kept in Edinburgh Castle alongside the other crown jewels. It is brought to London for coronations, most recently for the coronation of Charles III in 2023. There is a persistent tradition in Scotland that the Stone of Destiny kept at Scone was not the real stone, that the monks of Scone hid the genuine stone when Edward I's forces arrived and substituted a plain sandstone block. The stone now in Edinburgh Castle is indeed a plain sandstone block, without any carving or decoration. The traditional descriptions of the Stone of Destiny, which suggest it was a more elaborately carved object, have led some people to argue that the real stone was hidden centuries ago and has not been found. This theory is almost certainly wrong, but it is the kind of theory that Scotland generates with particular regularity, because Scotland is a country where significant things have been lost and hidden and destroyed and forgotten often enough that the suggestion that another significant thing was also lost or hidden is entirely credible. The village of Fortingall in Perthshire contains what may be the oldest living thing in Britain. The Fortingall yew is a yew tree in the village churchyard that has been estimated, with varying degrees of confidence and various methodologies, to be somewhere between 2,000 and 9,000 years old. The uncertainty in the age estimate is enormous because yew trees do not have rings in the way that allow tree ring dating, and because the tree has been damaged and partially regrown multiple times over the centuries. The outer rings of the current multiple stems are relatively recent. The oldest material, if it survives at all, would be at the core of what is now a largely hollow and fragmented trunk. Even at the lower end of the age estimates, a 2,000-year-old yew is extraordinary. At the higher end, a 9,000-year-old yew would have been a young tree when the Neolithic farmers were building Maeshowe. It would have been ancient when the Picts were carving their symbol stones. It would have been older than Christianity when Christianity came to Scotland. And it is still alive, still putting out new growth, still standing in a churchyard in Perthshire, looked at by visitors who cannot quite believe they are standing next to something that old. The Glenfinnan Viaduct, in the Western Highlands above Loch Shiel, carries the West Highland Line Railway across a steep valley. It was built in 1901 using mass concrete a method of construction that was then relatively new for major engineering works. The viaduct has 21 arches and curves as it crosses the valley, giving it a dramatic curved profile that has become one of the most photographed locations in Scotland. It has been seen in the Harry Potter films, where it stands in for a journey through the Scottish Highlands on the Hogwarts Express. The presence of Scotland in the Harry Potter films, and more broadly in the films and television series that have used its landscapes and castles and cities as settings for fantasy and historical drama over the past 30 years, has created an interesting situation in which a significant portion of the international understanding of Scotland is now mediated through fiction. Visitors come specifically to see the locations used in films, some of which bear a complicated relationship to the landscapes they were used to represent. Glencoe, one of the most dramatic valleys in Scotland, appears in several films and has been associated with the landscape of fantasy and epic in ways that sit alongside its actual history, which includes the massacre of Glencoe in 1692, when 38 members of the MacDonald clan were killed by government soldiers who had been quartered among them for 12 days. The massacre of Glencoe is remembered in Scotland as an act of particular treachery because the soldiers killed the MacDonalds while accepting their hospitality, a violation of the Highland Code of Hospitality that was as serious a moral transgression as the killing itself in the values of the culture. The men responsible were following orders from the government of William III, which had decided to make an example of the MacDonalds for their slow submission to the new regime. The fact that the killing was carried out by Campbell soldiers added a particular bitterness, since the Campbells and the MacDonalds had a long history of enmity. The memory of Glencoe has been used politically ever since, invoked whenever Scottish feelings about English or British authority become particularly acute. It is one of those events that refuses to become merely historical. The National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh has a gallery called The Kingdom of the Scots that contains the most important collection of medieval Scottish objects in existence. Walking through it is an experience of concentrated Scottish history. The Lewis chessmen are there. The Monymusk reliquary, a small silver and bronze casket made in the 8th century that may have contained a relic of St. Columba, and that was carried before the Scottish army at Bannockburn as a protection, is there. The Galloway Hoard, a collection of over 100 objects buried in the 10th century in Dumfries and Galloway, the most important Viking Age find made in Scotland, is there. The Hunterston brooch, one of the finest examples of insular metalwork ever found, made in about 700 CE and decorated with interlace patterns of extraordinary delicacy, is there. Each object carries within it a story of making, of use, of burial or loss, of rediscovery, of what it means to hold in your hands something that was important to people who lived 1,000 years ago. Scotland has, over the centuries, developed a complicated relationship with its own mythology. The romanticization of Highland culture that Scott initiated has been continued by tourism marketing and by the Scottish diaspora abroad, creating a version of Scottish identity that is heavily weighted toward kilts and castles and whiskey and bagpipes and the open landscape, and that sometimes sits uneasily with the more complicated realities of Scottish history. The descendants of people cleared from the Highlands often have a stronger and more sentimental attachment to the Highland tradition than the people who stayed in Scotland and had to live through the actual consequences of industrialization and urbanization and political subordination. The Glasgow that developed in the 19th century was one of the great industrial cities of the world, built on the tobacco trade, and then on cotton, and then on heavy industry, on shipbuilding and engineering and steel. At its peak, the Clyde was one of the busiest rivers for shipbuilding in the world. The ships that were built there, the Lusitania and the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, and hundreds of others, sailed to every ocean. The city that built them was simultaneously one of the most dynamic and one of the most brutal places in Victorian Britain, with extraordinary wealth and extraordinary poverty existing in close proximity, with overcrowding and disease and alcohol creating social problems of the first magnitude, and with a working-class culture that was creative and politically engaged and deeply rooted in community solidarity. Glasgow today is a city that has reinvented itself several times since the collapse of heavy industry in the 1970s and 80s. The museums, particularly the Kelvingrove Art Gallery and Museum and the Gallery of Modern Art and the Burrell Collection, which houses the extraordinary art collection donated to the city by the shipping magnate William Burrell in 1944, make it one of the more distinguished museum cities in Europe. The architecture ranges from magnificent Victorian civic buildings in the city centre to the extraordinary work of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, whose Glasgow School of Art, now damaged by fire but being restored, and whose domestic and commercial architecture throughout the city defined a distinctive Scottish variant of the Art Nouveau movement that influenced design across Europe. The Antonine Wall, which briefly marked the northern limit of Roman Britain in the 2nd century CE, runs from the Firth of Forth to the Firth of Clyde, a distance of about 37 miles. Unlike Hadrian's Wall, which was built primarily of stone, the Antonine Wall was built primarily of turf on a stone foundation, which is why so much less of it survives above ground. Where Hadrian's Wall is a dramatic presence in the English landscape, with sections of its stone facing still standing several courses high, the Antonine Wall is mostly a subtle ridgeline, a slight elevation in the ground that you might not recognize as human construction if you were not looking for it. But in several places the remains are more substantial. At Rough Castle, near Falkirk, the earthworks survive in exceptional condition. The wall itself has eroded to a low grassy bank, but the defensive ditch in front of it is still clearly visible. And behind the wall, the outlines of the Roman fort at Rough Castle can be traced from the humps and hollows left by the foundations of the barracks and headquarters buildings. And in front of the ditch, the row of pits called Lilia, designed to trap and injure attackers who managed to cross the outer ditch, are among the best preserved examples of this Roman defensive feature anywhere in the empire. Standing at Rough Castle and looking north over the ground that the Antonine Wall was built to control, you are standing where a Roman soldier stood almost 2,000 years ago, looking out at the same hills, the same general shape of the landscape, wondering what was out there. What was out there was the territory of the Caledonians, the ancestors of the people the Romans would call Picti, and the Romans decided, twice, that whatever it contained was not worth the cost of finding out more thoroughly. The decision to build the Antonine Wall and then abandon it within 20 years tells you something important about Roman imperial decision-making. The Romans were not squeamish about violence or conquest. They absorbed enormously difficult territories in other parts of the empire, fighting prolonged and bloody campaigns in Germany and Dacia and Parthia. The decision to draw a line at the Fourth Clyde Isthmus and eventually to fall back to Hadrian's Wall was not a failure of military will. It was a calculation about cost and benefit, a decision that the resources required to hold and administer northern Scotland were greater than any realistic benefit of doing so. This calculation was probably correct. The part of Scotland south of the Fourth Clyde line was absorbed into Roman Britain, though always as a somewhat restive frontier zone rather than as a settled province in the way that the southeast of England was settled. North of the line, the Caledonians and then the Picts remained independent throughout the entire period of Roman Britain. This means that for nearly 400 years, from the Claudian invasion in 43 CE to the effective end of Roman administration in Britain in the early 5th century, the people of northern Scotland were never Roman. They were not Romanized. They did not adopt Latin, or Roman law, or Roman architecture, or the Roman religious tradition, or the Christian faith in its Roman institutional form. This has significant consequences for Scottish history. The southern part of Britain, which was Roman for nearly 4 centuries, emerged from the Roman period with a Latin-influenced culture, a Christian religious tradition organized on Roman administrative lines, a memory of Roman law and governance, and the ruins of Roman infrastructure, roads and towns and walls and forts. The northern part of Britain, which was never Roman, had none of this. It had its own traditions, its own social organization, its own religious framework, its own artistic tradition. When the political conditions in post-Roman Britain made possible the eventual formation of the Kingdom of Scotland, it was formed from this un-Romanized tradition, which meant it looked different from the kingdoms that emerged in the Romanized south of Britain. The Gaelic language, which became the language of the court of the early Scottish kingdom, was itself a language that had developed entirely outside the Roman cultural sphere. Old Irish and Scottish Gaelic are members of the Celtic language family, related to Welsh and Breton and Cornish, but they developed their distinctive features in communities that never came under Roman administrative control, and that therefore never acquired the Latin overlay that affected the other Celtic languages to varying degrees. The specifically Gaelic flavour of Scottish culture, the storytelling tradition, the bardic poetry, the musical forms, the specific relationship with landscape encoded in the Dinsianchas, all of these have their roots in a cultural tradition that was untouched by Rome. This is one of the factors that makes Scotland's cultural contribution to the modern world so distinctive. It combines, in a single national tradition, the rigorously systematic and rationalist aspects of Enlightenment thought, which do have roots in the classical tradition that Rome transmitted, with aspects of Celtic and Norse and pre-Christian culture that represent a completely different tradition of human knowledge and expression. When Burns writes about a mouse disturbed by a plough, he is doing something that draws on both traditions simultaneously. The precise observation of natural detail that is part of the Enlightenment scientific tradition, and the animistic attention to non-human consciousness that comes from a much older cultural tradition. The Picts built churches. This is not always remembered, because the Pictish church has left fewer visible remains than the Pictish symbol stones, but the conversion of the Pictish kingdoms to Christianity in the 6th and 7th centuries was followed by a period of church building and monastic foundation that was substantial and sophisticated. The Pictish church was part of the broader tradition of the insular or Celtic church that Columba represented, and it maintained its independence from Rome in various respects until the 9th century, when the consolidation of the Kingdom of Alba began a process of standardization that aligned Scottish ecclesiastical practice more closely with the Roman tradition. The Christianity of the insular tradition had a character that was in some respects quite different from the Roman tradition. It placed enormous value on learning and scholarship, maintaining scriptoria where the texts of classical antiquity were copied and preserved alongside biblical and theological works. It gave a prominent role to penitential practice, the detailed and systematic performance of spiritual disciplines designed to repair the damage done by sin. It valued the tradition of the peregrinus, the wandering monk who left his homeland and travelled through the world in a form of voluntary exile that was understood as a spiritual discipline. It was through this tradition of wandering that Columba came to Scotland, and through which missionaries from the insular tradition spread across northern Europe in the 6th and 7th centuries. The street, Andrew's legend, is worth telling because it illustrates how thoroughly Scotland has been a crossroads of the European world, even in periods that seem remote and provincial. Straint, Andrews, the small university town on the east coast of Fife that gives its name to the most famous golf course in the world, acquired its significance in the early medieval period through a story that connects it to one of the most important figures in the early Christian world. The tradition holds that Saint Regulus, also called Rule, was a monk in the Greek church who received a divine instruction in the 4th century to take the relics of the Apostle Andrew and carry them to a place at the edge of the world. He travelled with the relics by sea, was shipwrecked on the east coast of Fife, and built a church at the place where the shipwreck occurred. This became the foundation of the Shrine of St. Andrews, which attracted pilgrims from across Britain and Europe throughout the medieval period. Whether any of this happened is entirely uncertain. The historical reality of St. Regulus is doubtful, and the story of the relics has the character of a founding legend rather than a historical account. But what the story encodes is significant. It connects Scotland, in its own foundational mythology, to the ancient Church of Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean. It places Scotland at the end of a pilgrimage that began in a world as old and as significant as any in early Christianity. The Apostle Andrew, one of the 12 disciples, became Scotland's patron saint. His diagonal cross, the saltire, became the Scottish national flag. On a blue background, The white diagonal cross of Andrew is among the oldest national symbols in Europe. The golf course at St. Andrews is a kind of secular equivalent of the pilgrimage to the shrine. People travel to it from across the world with a reverence that is not entirely unlike the reverence that brought medieval pilgrims to the same town. The old course, the oldest golf course in the world, has been played on continuously since at least the 15th century, and probably for much longer. The rules of golf were formally codified at St. Andrews. The game, which has been exported to virtually every country in the world, originated in Scotland, and its specific form, the links course, the particular type of landscape over which the game was first played, is a landscape found naturally along the Scottish coasts. The links land that lies between the shore and the cultivated ground, sandy and undulating, and swept by coastal winds. The origin of golf in Scotland is one of those facts that seems both obviously appropriate and slightly mysterious. The Scottish landscape and the Scottish climate do not look, on the surface, like the conditions that would produce a pleasant outdoor recreational activity. The links are cold. The wind is usually present and frequently strong. The rain is a frequent companion. And yet the game of golf, which requires extraordinarily precise physical skill combined with the ability to manage the psychological pressures of competition, developed in this environment and has proved to be one of the most exportable cultural products Scotland has ever created. The game is played in places of extraordinary climatic difference, from the Scottish links where it originated, from the deserts of Arizona to the tropics of Southeast Asia, and yet it retains something specifically Scottish in its character, an insistence on precision, a tolerance for difficulty, and a cultural tradition of understatement in the face of adversity that is very recognizable. The Scottish tradition of understatement deserves a moment's attention. One of the more consistent threads in Scottish culture across its historical periods is a distrust of bombast, a preference for precision over grandeur, and a wry awareness of the gap between what is claimed and what is real. This is not indifference to excellence. The people who designed the Fourth Rail Bridge and articulated the theory of the free market and discovered penicillin were not indifferent to excellence, but they tended to express that excellence in terms of specific problems solved and specific observations made rather than in terms of general assertions of greatness. Burns is the supreme example of this quality in the literary tradition. He wrote about a mouse, a louse on a lady's bonnet, a haggis, a daisy crushed by a plough. He wrote about the emotional specificities of love and loss in a register of precise observation rather than rhetorical grandeur. His political poetry is devastatingly effective, not because it makes large claims, but because it describes specific realities with an accuracy that makes their implications unavoidable. A Man's a Man for That, which is probably his most explicitly political poem, works by accumulating specific observations about the relationship between rank and worth, and then drawing the logical conclusion that human dignity is independent of social status. The Scottish law of the three verdicts, including the verdict of not proven, which is unique to Scotland and has no equivalent in any other legal system in the world, is another expression of this cultural commitment to precision. In most legal systems, a jury can find a defendant guilty or not guilty. In Scotland, a jury can also find a defendant not proven, which means that the case against them was not convincingly made but does not amount to an assertion of innocence. The verdict has been controversial throughout its history, and there are periodic calls to abolish it, but it persists as a recognition that the truth of a legal matter is sometimes genuinely ambiguous, and that forcing a binary choice between guilt and innocence in cases where the evidence does not support such a choice is itself a distortion of justice. The Scottish commitment to precision appears again in the specific quality of Scottish scientific work. The emphasis on measurement, on the careful and systematic collection of data before drawing conclusions, on the importance of testing hypotheses against empirical observation, was not unique to Scottish science, but it was present in Scottish science with unusual consistency. James Hutton's geological observations at Siccar Point were made and recorded with extraordinary care before the theoretical conclusions were drawn. Joseph Black's discovery of latent heat was the result of meticulous measurement of temperature changes in carefully controlled experiments. James Clerk Maxwell's equations were derived from a rigorous mathematical analysis of the physical observations that preceded them. This combination of careful empirical observation and bold theoretical conclusion, the willingness to make the large claim once the evidence supports it, is one of the more characteristic moves in the Scottish intellectual tradition. You gather the evidence with precision, and then you follow it where it leads, even if where it leads overturns everything that was previously believed. Hutton at Sycamore Point, looking at the rock face and understanding that it represented millions of years of time that no theology had previously accommodated, and then writing about it, was doing exactly this. The evidence led there. The theory followed. The Traprain Law treasure deserves a closer look than the brief mention it received earlier, because it raises questions that connect Scotland to the broader story of the late Roman world in ways that are genuinely strange. The site itself, Traprain Law, is a large hill in East Lothian that rises abruptly from the surrounding flat farmland. It is visible from a considerable distance, and it dominates its landscape in a way that made it a natural focus for human activity over many centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests it was an important site from the Bronze Age onward, and in the Iron Age and early medieval period it was the capital, or at least a principal site, of the Votadini, the tribe that occupied the southeastern corner of what is now Scotland. The Votadini are one of the more interesting groups in the history of the northern British frontier. They occupied territory that was at the edge of Roman-controlled Britain, or sometimes within it, depending on which wall was the effective frontier at any given time. They appear to have maintained a generally cooperative relationship with Rome, or at least a relationship that Rome found useful enough to cultivate, rather than simply overwhelm. Roman goods found at Traprain Law suggest sustained trade and exchange. The silver hoard found in 1912 is the largest hoard of Roman silver ever found outside the Roman Empire, and it was found on the hill that was the capital of a tribe that was never Roman. The silver had been cut up, hack silver, chopped into pieces for use as a medium of exchange. This means it was being used as currency rather than as display objects. Some of it shows signs of having been deliberately flattened and cut in ways that suggest systematic weighing and measuring. This was not a decorative hoard. This was working capital, the treasury of a trading operation of some sophistication. Where did the silver come from? Several possibilities have been seriously proposed. It could be the proceeds of legitimate trade with Roman Britain, silver acquired in exchange for goods or services provided by the Votadini to Roman merchants or the Roman military. It could be tribute, paid to the Votadini by Rome to secure their cooperation, or at least their non-aggression on the northern frontier. It could be the proceeds of raiding into Roman Britain, silver looted from Roman towns and villas, and melted down or cut up for redistribution. It could be some combination of all three, since the practical realities of frontier zones typically involve all three types of exchange simultaneously. The timing of the hoard's deposition is also interesting. The silver dates to the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, the period when Roman Britain was under increasing pressure from raids and the central administration of the empire was beginning to collapse. The silver may have been buried for safekeeping during a period of instability, never to be retrieved. Or it may have been a deliberately final deposit, a sacred offering made at a time when the old order was ending and new arrangements were being made. The Votadini, or a portion of them, appear in Welsh tradition and possibly in historical sources as the Gododin, the name their descendants used. The earliest Welsh poem, Why Gododin, composed probably in the 6th or 7th century CE and attributed to the poet Aneirin, commemorates a raid by warriors of the Gododin from their capital at Dyn Eidyn, which is identified with Edinburgh Castle Rock, south to attack the Angles at Catraeth, believed to be modern Catterick in Yorkshire. The raid failed catastrophically. Most of the warriors died. The poem mourns them individually, in a series of verses that praise each man's courage and generosity and deplore his loss. Why Gododin is one of the earliest substantial poems in any of the Brittonic Celtic languages, and it is preserved in a manuscript in the National Library of Wales. Its subject matter, the warriors of the late 6th century CE who rode south from what is now Edinburgh to fight and die in what is now Yorkshire, is a reminder that the political and cultural geography of Britain in the early medieval period was completely different from anything that followed. The borders that now divide Scotland from England and England from Wales did not exist. The tribal territories of the various peoples who inhabited Britain overlapped and shifted, and sometimes fought each other, and sometimes combined against common enemies, in patterns of alliance and enmity that looked nothing like the national stories of any of those countries as they would later develop. The Gododin poem contains a reference to a warrior's battle fury that some scholars have identified as possibly the earliest known allusion to the figure of Arthur. The reference is brief and oblique, comparing the valor of one of the Gododin warriors to that of Arthur, suggesting that Arthur was already a figure of legendary courage by the time the poem was composed. The debate about the historical Arthur, whether he existed, who he was, what he did, is enormous and has been going on for centuries. The Y Gododin reference is important because it places the Arthurian legend in the context of the late and post-Roman North British world, the world of the Gododin and the Picts and the Scots of Dalriata, rather than in the romanticized medieval Arthurian tradition of southern England and France. Some scholars have proposed that the historical Arthur, if he existed, was a military leader of the late 5th or early 6th century CE who operated in this northern British world, fighting against the Angles who were pressing northward into formerly Roman territory. This would place him in the landscape of southern Scotland and northern England, rather than in the landscape of Cornwall and Wiltshire where the Arthurian romance tradition later located him. The evidence for this is fragmentary and contested, as evidence from this period always is. But it is an intriguing possibility that the most famous figure in the medieval romance tradition was a man of the Scottish borders and the northern plains, and that his legend was taken south and transformed beyond recognition by the storytelling traditions of a later and more southerly culture. The standing stones of Scotland are much more numerous than most people realise. The well-known monuments Brodgar and Stenness and Callanish attract attention because of their scale and their completeness, but there are single standing stones and small groups of stones and recumbent stone circles and stone rows distributed across the entire country in numbers that run into the thousands. Many of them are in agricultural fields, standing in the middle of cultivated ground, ploughed around for centuries by farmers who knew better than to remove them even when the stones served no obvious practical purpose. The farmers who left the standing stones in place were not being sentimental about their ancestors. They were responding to a real and persistent tradition that removing a standing stone was unlucky, that it would lead to misfortune for the person who moved it, and possibly for their community. This tradition of avoidance, of leaving alone the things that had been put in the ground by whoever came before, is itself a form of historical preservation. The stones are still there because generations of people believed, or at least half believed, that moving them would bring trouble. Whether or not they were right, the result is that Scotland has an exceptional density of prehistoric standing stones, and that many of them stand in the specific locations where they were placed 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. The recumbent stone circles are a monument type found only in a specific part of northeastern Scotland, primarily in Aberdeenshire and the adjacent parts of Moray and Banff. They are stone circles in which the largest stone, instead of standing upright, lies on its side, horizontally, between two upright flanking stones. The recumbent stone in each circle is selected for specific qualities, particularly for the way it frames the view of the horizon to the southwest, where the moon, at specific points in its complex cycle, appears to rise and set above the recumbent. The stone selection was therefore oriented to the moon's movements in a way that required long and careful observation before construction. The recumbent stone circles cluster in a region that has good agricultural land and a relatively mild climate for its latitude, and they appear to have been the focus of community activity and possibly of ancestor veneration. The cremated remains of human beings have been found in many of them, usually in the interior space near the recumbent stone. The combination of astronomical orientation and human remains suggests that these monuments were places where the living maintained relationships with the dead through the mediation of the moon's movements, a cosmological framework of a specific and sophisticated kind. The fact that the recumbent stone circles are found only in this specific part of Scotland suggests that they were the expression of a specific cultural group, a community that maintained its distinct traditions while presumably interacting with other communities who were building different kinds of monuments in different parts of Scotland at the same time. This is a reminder that the Neolithic and Bronze Age inhabitants of Scotland were not a single undifferentiated people with a single culture. They were many communities with distinct traditions, building different things in different ways for reasons that reflected their specific beliefs and their specific relationships with their landscapes. The Brocks are the most dramatic example of this regional specificity, as we have already discussed, but they are far from the only one. The recumbent circles of the northeast, the clava cairns of the Inverness area, the souterrains of the Pictish territories, the crannogs of the Western Lochs, the Cursus monuments of the lowlands, the megalithic tombs of different types distributed across different regions, all of these reflect communities that were developing specific architectural and ritual traditions in specific places in response to specific conditions. The Cursus monuments are one of the less discussed prehistoric monument types in Scotland, perhaps because they are difficult to see except from the air or from careful observation of LiDAR images. A cursus is a long, narrow enclosure, defined by parallel ditches and banks, typically measuring several hundred meters to several kilometers in length, and between 50 and 100 meters wide. They date to the Neolithic period. Their function is entirely unknown. They were clearly important enough to merit the considerable effort of constructing them, but what that effort was directed toward remains a complete mystery. The word cursus was coined by the 18th century antiquarian William Stukely, who noticed a particularly impressive example near Stonehenge and interpreted it as a Roman racetrack, hence the Latin name. This interpretation was wrong. Cursus monuments predate Roman Britain by thousands of years, but the name has stuck, and archaeologists continue to use it simply because it is useful to have a word for this specific type of monument, even if that word is etymologically misleading. What were Cursus monuments for? The leading current hypothesis is that they were processional routes, paths along which some form of ritual movement took place, possibly associated with the seasonal movement of the sun or moon, possibly associated with the movement of the dead between this world and whatever world was imagined beyond it. The long, narrow, bounded space of a cursus would be a good setting for a procession, for a movement that was linear and directed and enclosed. But this is a hypothesis based on analogy with other cultures' ritual practices, not on direct evidence from the Cursus monuments themselves. Scotland has several Cursus monuments. The most impressive, or at least the most thoroughly studied, is the Cleven Dyke in Perthshire, which runs for approximately 2 kilometres through the landscape north of Perth. It was constructed in the Neolithic period and appears to have been a significant focus of activity for its region. Walking along it today, in the fields that have been cultivated around it for centuries, is a slightly surreal experience. You are walking along a bank that has survived 4,000 or 5,000 years, that was built for reasons you cannot know by people whose beliefs you cannot reconstruct, in a landscape that has been almost entirely transformed in every other respect since the monument was made. The question of what Scotland is, at the deepest level, is one that the country has been asking itself for centuries without reaching a definitive answer. It is a country with multiple languages, multiple legal traditions, multiple religious traditions, multiple geographic and cultural zones that have sometimes been more hostile to each other than to any external power. The Highlands and the Lowlands were not simply different regions in the way that different regions of any country are different. They were at various periods in Scottish history effectively different cultures, speaking different languages, organizing themselves differently, regarding each other with deep suspicion and frequent hostility. The Highland-Lowland divide ran through Scottish politics and culture from the medieval period well into the 19th century. The Gaelic-speaking Highlands were often characterized by Lowland Scots as barbaric and anarchic, a characterization that reflected the very real differences in social organization and values between the two cultures, but that also reflected a lowland desire to distinguish themselves from the more obviously different Highlanders in order to claim proximity to the values of the wider European world. The Highlanders returned the favour by regarding the Lowlanders as people who had lost their roots and their honour in the pursuit of money and English approval. What held Scotland together, across these internal divisions and through the long period of political union with England, was something that is difficult to define precisely, but that can be recognised. It is partly a shared history, including a shared history of resistance to outside pressure. It is partly a set of institutions, the church, the law, the education system, that maintained their distinctiveness within the Union and provided a framework within which Scottish identity could persist even without political independence. It is partly a literature, from Burns and Scott to Stevenson and Conan Doyle, to the contemporary writers whose work continues to engage with the specific textures of Scottish life. And it is partly the language itself, which has a character so specific that it has shaped everyone who has lived in it and who has tried to make sense of it. The landscape of Scotland is not simply beautiful, though it is that, sometimes almost unbearably so. It is also demanding, in the sense that it does not allow you to be passive in relation to it. The scale of the Highland landscape, the width of the glens, and the height of the mountains, and the length of the sea locks, the changeability of the weather, the quality of the light, which shifts constantly and dramatically, and produces effects that are unlike anything else in the temperate world. All of these things press on the person moving through them. You cannot ignore a Scottish landscape. You have to respond to it. The writers who have engaged most deeply with this landscape, from Robert Burns' precise and democratic observation of the Ayrshire countryside to Norman MacCaig's philosophical attention to the light and stone of Assynt, from Hugh MacDiarmid's difficult and ambitious attempt to create a new Scottish literature adequate to the complexity of Scottish experience, to Nan Shepherd's extraordinary prose meditation on the Cairngorm Plateau, The Living Mountain, which describes the mountains but the kind of consciousness that develops in a person who lives in close relation to them. All of these writers are responding to the specific quality of their landscape, describing it and thinking along with it simultaneously, using the landscape as a medium for working out questions of identity and mortality, and the relationship between human consciousness and the physical world. Nan Shepherd's The Living Mountain was written during the Second World War, though not published until 1977. It is a short book about walking in the Cairngorm Mountains, and it is one of the great books about landscape in the English language. Shepherd was not interested in the mountains as obstacles to be overcome or peaks to be bagged. She was interested in the experience of being on the mountain, of moving through it and sitting in it, and lying in the burns that run from it, of developing over decades of intimate attention, a kind of knowledge that she explicitly identifies as different from the knowledge produced by scientific measurement or artistic description. She calls it a going in, a penetration beyond surface observation into some kind of participation in the life of the mountain itself. The Cairngorms, she writes, are a plateau rather than a range of peaks, and approaching them is not like approaching individual summits, but like walking into a world that is complete in itself, with its own weather, its own light, its own time. The Cairngorm Plateau, which covers about 1,000 square kilometers at an average altitude of over 1,000 meters, is the largest area of high ground in Britain. It supports a subarctic ecosystem of a kind found nowhere else in Britain, with plants and animals adapted to the harsh conditions of altitude and weather. The snow sometimes persists in the north-facing corries through the summer. The plateau in winter conditions, in whiteout and with wind speeds that can exceed hurricane force, is a genuinely dangerous environment. People die there, most years, from exposure and disorientation and falls, and yet it draws people continuously, because the experience of the high plateau in good conditions, with the vast views in every direction and the quality of light and air that altitude produces, is exceptional. The introduction of skiing to the Cairngorms in the 1960s was the beginning of a long conflict between those who wanted to develop the mountains for economic purposes and those who wanted to protect them. The conflict has never been fully resolved. The Cairngorm Mountain Ski Area operates today on the upper slopes of Cairngorm, using mechanized transport to bring skiers to the high ground. The ecological impact of this development, including the damage to the fragile subarctic vegetation, is an ongoing concern. The Cairngorms National Park, established in 2003 and the largest national park in the United Kingdom, provides a framework for managing the tension between economic use and ecological protection, but does not eliminate it. This tension between use and protection runs through the entire relationship between Scotland and its wild places. The grouse moors, which cover large areas of the Scottish uplands and are managed for driven grouse shooting by the wealthy individuals and estates who own them, are one of the most contentious landscape management questions in Scotland. The management regime, which involves intensive burning of heather, control of predators including raptors and other birds, and drainage of wetlands, produces a landscape that is ecologically impoverished compared to what it would be under a more natural regime. The economic value of driven grouse shooting, which is real and substantial, has to be weighed against the ecological and aesthetic and social costs of a management system that prioritizes a single, expensive recreational activity over a wide range of other values. The reintroduction of formerly native species is one of the most exciting developments in Scottish conservation. The white-tailed eagle, which was extinct in Scotland for most of the 20th century, was reintroduced from Norway beginning in the 1970s and has now established breeding populations on the west coast and in various other locations. The red kite, which survived in Wales and was reintroduced to Scotland in the 1990s, is now breeding successfully in several areas. The beaver, which was hunted to extinction in Scotland by the 16th century, was reintroduced experimentally on the River Tay and has now been given legal protection as a native species. There are ongoing discussions about the possible reintroduction of the lynx, which was also native to Scotland and has been extinct here for at least 1,000 years. The wolf, which was hunted to extinction in Scotland in the 17th or 18th century, is the most contentious potential reintroduction. The ecological case for wolf reintroduction is significant. The absence of wolves from the Scottish Highlands has contributed to the overgrazing of the landscape by red deer, whose numbers in the absence of natural predators have grown to a level that is ecologically damaging. Wolves would help to regulate deer numbers and, through the behavioral changes their presence induces in deer populations, would allow forest regeneration in areas that are currently too heavily grazed to support tree growth. This is the trophic cascade that has been documented in places like Yellowstone National Park in the United States, where wolf reintroduction dramatically changed the landscape by changing how deer used it. The arguments against wolf reintroduction center primarily on the interests of sheep farmers, who are genuinely concerned about livestock predation, and on questions of public safety, which are probably overstated given the extremely low level of wolf attacks on humans, documented even in areas of Europe where wolf populations are substantial. The debate is ongoing and is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. The question of what the Scottish Highlands should look like is ultimately a question about what Scotland values and what it owes to its land and to its future. The heavily managed grouse moor landscape is the product of particular economic and social decisions made in the 19th century. The rewilded landscape proposed by conservation advocates would look quite different and would serve different interests. Neither version is simply natural. Both are produced by human decisions and human management, or by the decision to reduce human management. The difference is in whose values are expressed and whose interests are served. Scotland's relationship with the sea is as old as the country itself, and as important as any other single factor in its history. The country has about 18,000 miles of coastline, including all the islands, which is more than any other country in Europe relative to its area. The sea that surrounds and penetrates Scotland has been a highway, a food source, a barrier, a cultural connector, and a constant presence in the lives of the people who live near it. The fishing communities of the East Coast, the Norse-descended island communities of the North, the Gaelic-speaking communities of the West, all organized their lives around the sea in ways that shaped their cultures and their economies for centuries. The herring fishery was, for several centuries, the most important single industry in Scotland. In the 19th century, Scottish herring boats worked the North Sea and the waters of the west coast and the islands, and the Scottish herring curing industry supplied salted herring to markets across Europe. The fisher communities that grew up around this industry, in towns like Wick and Peterhead and Fraserburgh on the Moray Firth coast, had their own distinctive cultures, their own social organisations, their own religious traditions. The decline of the herring fishery in the 20th century, through a combination of overfishing and changed market conditions, was devastating for these communities in ways that are still visible in the social and economic fabric of the northeast coast today. The offshore oil industry, which began to develop in the North Sea in the 1970s following the discovery of significant oil fields, transformed the economy of Aberdeen and the northeast. Aberdeen, which had been primarily a fishing and agricultural service centre, became the oil capital of Europe, attracting international energy companies, developing specialist engineering and logistics industries, and experiencing a property and economic boom that transformed the city and its wider region. The oil industry has also, over the past decade, been at the centre of debates about Scotland's economic future as the reserves that drove the original boom begin to deplete, and the global energy transition raises questions about the long-term viability of the North Sea oil industry. The last Gaelic speaker of the Pictish language probably died sometime in the 9th or 10th century CE, without anyone recording the fact that something unrepeatable was ending. This is how most languages end. Not with a declaration or a ceremony or a final act of documentation, but simply with the last person who knew the words dying quietly, and then the words being gone. The symbols on the stones outlasted the people who could read them, and then the people who could read them in the sense of understanding what they meant were gone too, and then the symbols themselves continued to exist in stone, while becoming progressively less intelligible to the descendants of the people who made them. There is something to sit with in this. The care that went into the making of the symbol stones, the selection of the right stone, the precise incision of the symbols, the composition of the decorative programs on the more elaborate stones, was the care of people who intended what they were making to last. They were right that it would last. The stones are still here. What they could not have anticipated was that the language of the stones would not last, that the symbols would outlast the tradition that gave them meaning. The permanence they achieved was a permanence they could not have imagined, a permanence beyond the reach of any community that could maintain the meaning. The language of stones is something Scotland has been speaking for 12,000 years. Since the first people began to notice the rocks they were walking on and to select from them the materials that would build the things they needed. The selection of particular stones for particular purposes, the understanding of which rock types would split predictably and which would not, which would hold an edge and which would crumble, which would withstand weather and which would not. This knowledge is one of the most fundamental forms of knowledge that the people of Scotland have developed. It was passed from hand to hand, from napper to student, from builder to apprentice, for millennia before writing existed, and was embedded in bodies and practices rather than in documents. The body knowledge of Scottish stoneworking is not entirely gone. There are stonemasons today in Scotland who understand the specific qualities of specific Scottish stones in ways that represent a continuous tradition, however much attenuated, going back many centuries. The sandstones of Orkney, which split in the flat sheets that made the Neolithic monuments of the islands possible, are still quarried and worked by people who know their properties intimately. The granite of Aberdeenshire, which was used to pave streets and build civic buildings throughout the British Empire in the 19th century and which is still worked by skilled masons, represents a tradition of engagement with a specific stone type that goes back to the Bronze Age. The iron ore that made the Scottish iron industry of the 18th and 19th centuries possible was present in the Lanarkshire and Ayrshire landscapes long before anyone extracted it commercially. The indigenous people who lived on those landscapes for thousands of years before industrialization knew the iron was there, in the way that intimate knowledge of a landscape reveals all its material properties. What changed in the 18th century was not the ore, which had always been there, but the combination of techniques, organization, capital, and market conditions that made its extraction economically viable on an industrial scale. The transformation of the Scottish landscape by industrialization was total and rapid. Within a few generations, landscapes that had been shaped primarily by agriculture and small-scale craft production were reshaped by coal mines and ironworks and textile mills, and the infrastructure that served them, canals and then railways and then roads. The population concentrated in the central belt, in the cities and towns that grew up around the industrial activities, at a speed that produced social conditions of the kind that Engels described in Manchester, and that were equally severe in Glasgow and Dundee and the mining towns of Lanarkshire and Ayrshire. The legacy of this industrialization is still visible in the Scottish landscape, both in the built environment and in the geography of deprivation. The post-industrial communities of the Central Belt, the former mining and steel and textile towns that lost their economic base in the late 20th century, are still dealing with the social and economic consequences of that loss. The health outcomes in parts of Glasgow are among the worst in Western Europe for a city of its wealth and size, a disparity that reflects decades of industrial decline and the social fragmentation that follows it. Scotland's relationship with drink is a complicated part of this legacy. The Scottish rates of alcohol-related illness and death have historically been among the highest in Europe, a product of multiple factors, including the social circumstances of post-industrial communities, cultural attitudes toward drinking that have their own historical roots, and specific policy decisions that affected the price and availability of alcohol. Scotland introduced minimum unit pricing for alcohol in 2018, the first country in the world to do so, as a public health measure designed to reduce consumption and alcohol-related harm. Early evidence suggests the policy has been at least partially effective. The Scottish drinking tradition and the whisky industry that sustains it commercially are not the same thing. The whisky industry is a source of significant national pride and economic benefit, and the relationship between Scotland and whisky has a cultural dimension that goes well beyond simple consumption. The craft of distillation, the knowledge of fermentation and wood aging and blending, the deep engagement with the specific qualities of specific water sources and specific peat reserves, all of these represent forms of expertise and tradition that are genuinely impressive. The Scotch whisky industry today includes over 150 operating distilleries, many of them in historic buildings that have been used for distillation for a century or more. The industry employs directly and indirectly tens of thousands of people. The export value of Scotch whisky is measured in billions of pounds annually, and the knowledge that underlies the industry, the understanding of how to coax specific flavors from specific raw materials using specific processes, is accumulated across generations of distillers who learned from their predecessors and taught their successors. The different regional styles of Scotch whisky reflect genuine differences in the raw materials and processes used in different parts of Scotland. The heavily peated whiskies of Islay taste the way they do because the peat of Islay has a specific composition derived from the specific plant communities that accumulated there over thousands of years that imparts flavors different from the peat of other regions. The lighter whiskies of Speyside taste the way they do because the water of the Spey Valley has a specific mineral composition derived from the specific geology through which it flows that affects the fermentation and distillation processes. These are not marketing claims. They are the product of genuinely different conditions producing genuinely different results. The Callanish stones on the Isle of Lewis are perhaps the most dramatic prehistoric monument in Scotland after the Orkney complex, and in some respects they are even more strange. The main stone circle at Callanish is a roughly circular arrangement of standing stones with a single tall central stone and a short avenue of paired stones leading into the circle from the north. There are subsidiary stone settings nearby, other smaller circles and groups. The whole complex extends over a significant area on a peninsula jutting into Loch Roge on the west coast of Lewis. The main circle is aligned to the south, toward a distant hill called Mullach and Langer, which from the circle site presents a silhouette that resembles a reclining figure. At the time of the major lunar standstill, an event that occurs every 18.6 years, the full moon in summer rises over this hill, moves along its skyline, and sets into the central avenue of the Callanish circle. The full moon actually appears to walk into the stone circle. This is not a metaphor. It is a description of the visual effect as seen from specific points around the monument. For anyone watching from the right position, the moon appears to descend into the stones. The major lunar standstill is one of the most dramatic astronomical events visible from Scotland. The moon reaches its highest and lowest positions in the sky in a cycle of approximately 18.5 years, and at the extreme of this cycle, the major standstill, its behavior becomes particularly dramatic. In the far north, at the latitude of Lewis, the moon at the major standstill summer can skim along the horizon without setting, a phenomenon as striking in its way as the midnight sun. Callanish is oriented to observe and mark this phenomenon. The builders of Callanish were therefore tracking a cycle of approximately 18.5 years, which requires multi-generational observation. No single person can live long enough to observe the full cycle repeatedly and understand it thoroughly. The knowledge that the cycle exists and what it looks like requires teaching, requires that the observations made by one generation be transmitted to the next generation, who add their own observations and transmit the accumulated knowledge to the next generation in turn. This is long-term science. Science conducted over lifetimes and across generations, without instruments and without writing. That this was happening in Lewis, in the Bronze Age, is documented by the monument itself. The monument is the record. The stones are where they are because of what the builders knew, and what the builders knew required generations of observation to accumulate. When you stand at Callanish and look toward Mullagh and Langer and understand what the builders were tracking, you are connected to a scientific tradition that goes back further than any written record. The question of why the moon's movements at the major standstill were important enough to warrant the construction of a monument as substantial as Callanish is one that cannot be answered definitively. But it is possible to speculate productively. In a culture organized around agricultural and pastoral seasons, in a landscape where the weather is highly variable, and where the ability to predict seasonal changes has significant practical importance, any reliable long-term astronomical cycle is a resource. The 18.5-year lunar cycle would have been a marker against which other observations could be calibrated. Communities that understood this cycle and could predict when the next major standstill would occur would have a form of temporal knowledge unavailable to communities that did not. Whether this is the explanation for Callanish is unknown. The monument may have served functions that were entirely ceremonial and religious, without any practical astronomical purpose. Or the ceremonial and the practical may have been inseparable, with the observation of the moon's movements at the major standstill being simultaneously a practical activity and a deeply sacred one. In most pre-modern cultures, the distinction between practical knowledge and sacred knowledge that modern Western thought imposes is not meaningful. The movements of the celestial bodies were simultaneously facts about the physical world and the activities of supernatural beings whose behavior it was important to understand and to properly honor. The island of Lewis itself is worth dwelling on for a moment because it is one of the more extraordinary places in Scotland and one of the more overlooked. It is the largest of the Outer Hebrides, a chain of islands that runs along the Atlantic edge of Scotland from the Butt of Lewis in the north to Vatersay in the south. The Outer Hebrides are separated from the Scottish mainland by the Minch, a body of water that in bad weather is genuinely severe, and they face the open Atlantic to the west, with nothing between them and North America but 3,000 miles of ocean. The Outer Hebrides are the heartland of Scottish Gaelic in the 21st century. Lewis and Harris, which are a single island despite the different names for their northern and southern sections, have the highest proportion of Gaelic speakers of any area in Scotland. The language is heard on the street and in the shops and in the pubs. The local newspaper, the Stornoway Gazette, publishes content in both English and Gaelic. The television channel BBC Alba, which is broadcast from Stornoway, provides Gaelic language content to the islands and to Gaelic speakers across Scotland. The Free Church of Scotland, which is still a significant presence in Lewis in a way that it is not in most other parts of Scotland, represents a tradition of austere Calvinist Presbyterianism that has shaped the culture of the island deeply. The Sabbath observance on Lewis, which until relatively recently meant that almost all commercial and recreational activity stopped on Sunday, is a surviving expression of a religious culture that was once widespread in Scotland and that has retreated almost everywhere else. The ferry services from the mainland to Lewis are still a subject of controversy in this regard, with some community voices opposing Sunday sailings on religious grounds. This coexistence of one of the most ancient prehistoric religious traditions in Britain, represented by Callanish, with one of the more austere forms of Protestant Christianity, on the same small island, is another of those Scottish juxtapositions that would be too contrived to be believed in fiction. The stones at Callanish are still there, doing whatever it is they do, and the churches of Lewis are still standing, and the Gaelic language moves between them, carrying the oldest surviving linguistic tradition in the area, while serving both the needs of a 21st century community and the preservation of a culture that extends back many centuries. The Flannan Isles are a group of small, uninhabited rocks about 21 miles west of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. They have a lighthouse, built in 1899, that was staffed by 3 lighthouse keepers when it was operational. On the 26th of December 1900, the supply ship Hesperus arrived at the Flannan Isles and found the lighthouse abandoned. The 3 keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, were gone. The lighthouse was in good order. The last entry in the log was dated December 15th. There was no sign of any struggle or accident. No bodies were ever found. The disappearance of the 3 Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers has never been explained. The most plausible explanation, that a freak wave struck the men while they were working on the landing platform on the western side of the island during a storm, is consistent with some of the evidence, including the damage to equipment on the west landing and the fact that the last log entries describe severe weather. But the specific circumstances remain unknown. All 3 men disappeared simultaneously, which argues against a simple accident that one of them might have survived or at least witnessed. The Flannan Isles mystery has attracted the kind of creative and speculative attention that unexplained disappearances always do. Poems have been written about it. Songs have been written about it. There is a Wilfred Wilson Gibson poem, Flannan Isle, that is one of the more famous mystery poems in the English language, describing the discovery of the empty lighthouse with a spare atmospheric power that the subject deserves. The mystery has never been solved, and probably cannot be solved now, because the witnesses to whatever happened are gone, and the physical evidence has long since been washed away. Scotland is a country with an unusual relationship to the uncanny. The folklore of the country is densely populated with beings and presences that are neither natural nor supernatural in the way that Christian theology defines those categories, but that occupy a space between the human world and whatever lies beyond it. The Scythian, already mentioned in the context of Schiehallion, appear throughout Scottish folklore, associated with hillocks and mounds, and the underground generally. The Each-Wizg, the water horse, a malevolent creature that lures people to ride it and then drags them underwater to their death, appears in stories from virtually every loch in Scotland. The Selkies, seal people who can shed their skins to take human form, appear particularly in the folklore of the northern and western islands. The Baubhan Sith, the fairy woman who appears to travellers and dances with them until they collapse from exhaustion and then feeds on their blood, is a figure from Highland tradition with an unusual degree of consistent detail across its many appearances. These traditions are not simply fanciful. They encode real information about real dangers. The Each-Wizg stories warn about the danger of lochs, which in a culture of people who frequently travelled near water and often could not swim, was genuinely life-threatening information. The Selkie stories, which typically involve the abduction of a seal woman's skin to force her to live as a human wife, and her eventual recovery of the skin and return to the sea, encode anxieties about marriage and captivity, and the competing claims of different worlds that are entirely recognizable in human terms. The Bauvan Sith, appearing specifically to tired travelers at dusk, is a figure whose danger is precisely situated at the moment of vulnerability when a person is most susceptible to poor judgment. The relationship between Scotland's folklore and its landscape is particularly intimate. The stories are not set in a generic fantasy landscape, but in specific named places, specific hills and lochs and passes and shores. The Eachweisg is not in a generic loch. It is in Loch Garv or Loch Maree or Loch nan Dubrachen. This geographical specificity makes the folklore both more vivid and more practically useful as a record of places where particular cautions should be exercised. It also means that the landscape is encoded with stories in a way that makes it impossible for people who know the traditions to move through it without being accompanied by the weight of those associations. This encoding of stories in landscape is not unique to Scotland, but it has been particularly well preserved here because the Gaelic storytelling tradition maintained a rigorous connection between narratives and the specific geographic features they described. The dinsanchas, the tradition of place lore in Irish and Scottish Gaelic, is the deliberate practice of associating stories with places and teaching those stories as a form of geographic and historical knowledge. A person who knew the dinsanchas of their territory knew the names of the hills and lochs and rivers, but the stories behind the names, the events that had happened there, the beings that inhabited or visited those locations. This was a way of storing and transmitting information that was encyclopedic in its scope, and that survived as long as the tradition of oral transmission survived. The suppression of Gaelic in the Scottish education system in the 19th and early 20th centuries was also a suppression of this tradition of landscape knowledge. When children could no longer speak Gaelic and could no longer hear the dinsanchas, they could no longer access the layer of meaning encoded in the landscape around them. The hills and lochs that their ancestors had known as presences full of story became simply hills and lochs, beautiful but dumb. The recovery of Gaelic and of the traditions it carries is partly a recovery of this landscape literacy, this capacity to read the world around you as a record of human experience and meaning. The light of Scotland is something that people who have lived there and then left tend to miss intensely and specifically. The quality of the light in the northern latitudes, particularly in the long days of summer and the prolonged twilights of spring and autumn, is unlike anything in more southerly places. In midsummer in the north of Scotland, the sky never quite gets dark. There is a residual luminosity in the northern sky throughout the night, a glow that persists from sunset to sunrise, and that gives the landscape a quality of suspended betweenness that is almost hallucinatory. Walking at midnight in Orkney or Shetland in June, in the pale pearl light that is neither day nor night, among landscapes that are old enough to make human time seem brief, is an experience of a very particular kind of strangeness. The winter light is different but equally powerful. The sun in December in the north of Scotland rises late and sets early, traversing a low arc across the southern sky and giving the landscape a quality of amber and shadow that is extraordinarily beautiful in the way that brief things are beautiful. The mountains in winter light, with their flanks of heather and dead bracken turned bronze and ochre, and the low sun catching the frost or the dusting of snow on the high tops, and the lochs reflecting a sky that is doing something with colour that is not quite like anything the same sky does in summer. All of this constitutes an aesthetic experience that has shaped everyone who has ever tried to paint or photograph or describe the Scottish landscape. The first photography of Scotland, in the 1840s and 1850s, was partly driven by the desire to capture this light. The calotype photographs of David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson, made in Edinburgh in the 1840s, are among the earliest photographs made anywhere, and they are already doing something specific with Scottish light and Scottish faces and Scottish landscape that reflects an understanding of the particular quality of the visual world they were recording. What does it mean that a country this small has been the source of so much that matters? The economics, the geology, the philosophy, the medicine, the engineering, the literature, the political ideas, the religious movements, the musical traditions, all generated in proportions that massively exceed what you would expect from a country of this size and this climate and these resources. The question has been asked many times and answered partially many times. The education system, the church, the universities, the social density of the intellectual community, the particular political position between England and Europe, the specific spur of the union which created both opportunity and anxiety. All of these contribute. But there is something else that is harder to name, a quality in the culture that combines rigor with passion, precision with emotion, practical problem-solving with philosophical ambition. The same tradition that produced Adam Smith's systematic economics produced Robert Burns' precisely observed and deeply felt lyric poetry. The same tradition that produced James Hutton's geological revolution produced the Highland tradition of keening, the elaborate, formalized expression of grief at funerals, in which the depth of feeling was matched by the precision of its formal expression. These are not contradictions. They are facets of the same cultural disposition, the disposition that can look at a geological rock face and feel the giddiness of infinite time, that can look at a stone circle and wonder what ceremonies took place inside it, and what those ceremonies meant to the people who performed them. Scotland is still working out what it is. The independence question has not been resolved, and may not be for some time, given the political and legal complexities introduced by Brexit and by the continuing difference in political preferences between Scotland and England. The Gaelic language is not dying, but is not thriving as robustly as its advocates would like. The land ownership patterns that were set by the clearances are being modified but not transformed. The wild places are being argued over in ways that reflect genuine disagreements about values and futures that will not be easily resolved. What is not in doubt is the strangeness of a landscape that contains 3-billion-year-old rocks and 5,000-year-old monuments and undeciphered symbol systems and calendar structures built before any other calendar structure we have found anywhere. The strangeness of a culture that can be simultaneously severely practical and almost uncontrollably romantic, that can produce both Adam Smith and Bonnie Prince Charlie as characteristic expressions of itself. The strangeness of a place that seems, for all its participation in the wider world, to remain in some essential way itself. Particular, distinctive, not quite like anywhere else. The deepest strangeness of Scotland may be its persistence. Not its geological persistence, though that is extraordinary enough. 3-billion-year-old rocks still forming the surface of the land. Not its archaeological persistence, though the monuments endure beyond all reasonable expectation, but its cultural persistence, the way that a specific character, a specific sensibility, a specific way of engaging with the world has survived invasion and suppression and economic catastrophe and political subordination and the enormous disrupting force of industrialization and remains recognizable in the 21st century. The Scottish character, to the extent that it is meaningful to speak of such a thing for a country as internally diverse as Scotland, is not simply a national stereotype. It is not the taciturn Highlander of Victorian romance or the hard-drinking Glaswegian of social realist fiction. It is something more complicated, something that holds together qualities that might seem contradictory. A deep attachment to specific places combined with a history of extraordinary mobility. A deep seriousness about ideas combined with a wry and deflating sense of humor. A capacity for intense loyalty combined with a willingness to argue with authority. A romantic attachment to the past combined with an equally powerful pragmatic orientation toward the future. These qualities have made Scotland's contribution to the wider world disproportionate in multiple domains simultaneously. A country of this size does not produce, by accident, both the theoretical framework for modern economics and the theory of deep geological time, both the foundation of modern medicine and the principles of electromagnetism, both the telephone and the television, both the national parks movement and the rational analysis of human nature. These things came from the same cultural tradition, the tradition that the Enlightenment refined, but did not create from nothing, that had its roots in the specific encounter between Celtic culture and Norse culture and Christian culture and the conditions of a specific northern landscape over more than 1,000 years. What Scotland is going to become in the next century is a question being actively debated in Scotland, and that will shape the answer to the broader questions of what Britain is going to be. The land ownership patterns are slowly changing. The Gaelic language is hanging on, perhaps stabilizing after centuries of decline. The wild places are being argued over with a seriousness that reflects a genuine commitment to their future. The political question of independence remains open. The country is small enough that these debates feel immediate and personal in ways that they do not in larger countries. The light is doing something extraordinary over the Pentland Firth right now, or over the Minch, or over the Sound of Mull, or over whatever body of water the Scottish weather is performing its transformations on at this particular moment. It has been doing this every evening for as long as there has been an atmosphere to refract it through. The rocks below it have been there for 3 billion years. The people who have watched this light have been watching it for 12,000 years. The symbols they carved, the stories they told, the songs they sang, the ideas they articulated are all part of the same long conversation, with a landscape that has never stopped being strange, and has never stopped rewarding the attention of the people who chose to live in it. The question is whether Scotland will continue to stay strange. It will do. The question is whether people will continue to pay the kind of close, patient attention that strangeness deserves. The skalds who composed the Orkney-Inga saga were trying to make sense of the earldom in the way that people have always tried to make sense of this country, by telling stories about it. The druids who lit fires on the hilltops at the solstices, the Pictish craftspeople who carved their symbols into stone, the monks who illuminated manuscripts at Iona by the light of oil lamps, the engineers who calculated the deflection of plumb lines on Schiehallion, the poets who listened to the sound of Gaelic by the fire in the cold northern evenings, all of them were doing the same thing, trying to make sense of a particular place, trying to find language, whether spoken or carved or sung or mathematically precise, adequate to the experience of living in this specific landscape, under this specific light, surrounded by this specific history. The deeper you dig into Scotland, the stranger it gets. This is not a reassuring statement exactly. Strange does not always mean comfortable, but strange in this context means inexhaustible. There is always more. The rock at Sycamore Point is still there. The cut marks on the claver-cairns are still there. The midwinter sun still floods the chamber at Maeshowe every December. The symbols on the Pictish stone still wait for someone who can read them. The empty glens still carry the memory of the people who were removed from them. The Gaelic tradition is still alive in the mouths of the 60,000 people who carry it. And the light is still doing what it has always done here. In the long evenings of the northern summer, and in the long shadows of the short winter days, and in the extraordinary quality of the morning light on the mountains that no photograph has ever quite captured, Scotland continues to present itself as a country that exceeds the capacity of any single story to contain it. You've spent several hours in that country tonight, in the geology and the archaeology and the history and the culture and the landscape and the light, in the company of people who lived here 3 billion years, and 12,000 years, and 5,000 years, and 2,000 years, and 500 years, and 200 years ago, all of whom left something behind. The rock they walked on, the stones they moved, the symbols they carved, the ideas they articulated, the songs they sang, the buildings they raised and the buildings they demolished, the people they were and the people they became. It is a particular kind of company to be in, and if you have spent this time in the dark, drifting between the voices and the images, between sleep and waking, then you have been keeping the kind of company that people in Scotland have kept for a very long time. The company of the night, when the world is quiet and the old questions become more vivid, and the strangeness of everything, including your own existence in this particular moment on this particular planet, becomes a little more accessible. The Pictish symbols will still be on the stones in the morning. The light will come up over whatever landscape is outside your window, different from the Scottish light but connected to it by the same sun that has been doing this every morning for 4.5 billion years. The old bones of the Lewisian gneiss will still be there under the Atlantic. And somewhere in Scotland, right now, the wind is moving over the moorland, and the lochs are dark, and the mountains are shapes against the sky, and something that was here before we arrived is still here, patient as geology, waiting to be found. If this journey through Scotland has given you something to think about, or something to feel, or simply a few hours of company in the dark, then it has done what it was meant to do. If you would like to come back for another one of these long, late-night journeys into history and landscape and mystery, you can subscribe to make sure you do not miss the next one. And if you want to leave a comment telling me where in the world you are right now, and what the light is like where you are, and whether you are watching this to help you sleep or because something in it has kept you awake, I would genuinely like to know. The stone at the center of Maeshowe, where the midwinter sun reaches every year without fail, has been waiting for that light for 5,000 years. The bones in the passage cairns of Clava are still oriented toward the southwest, toward the setting sun of the shortest day, as they have been for 4,000 years. The broch at Musa is still standing on its Shetland shore, as it has been for 2,000 years. Time in Scotland is long, and the things that have survived in it are extraordinary. Rest well. The deeper stories are still there, in the stone and the water and the light. They will be there tomorrow. You can go back to them whenever you need to.